Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the timeless ideas of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but not in the usual way. Instead of reviewing the book lesson by lesson or listing financial tips, we'll be drifting through gentle, meditative stories, each one inspired by a key idea from the book. These are quiet reflections on money, mindset, and the way we grow, not with urgency but with understanding. Think of it as a peaceful journey through the lessons Robert Kiyosaki learned from two very different father figures, told slowly with care to help you relax, reflect, and maybe even learn while you sleep. If you love falling asleep to thoughtful stories that teach without pressure, consider subscribing. This is one long, calming experience, and we'll begin softly with the first lesson. Lesson 1. The rich don't work for money. Story 1. The game behind the paycheck. You may remember your first paycheck. Perhaps it was small, barely folded in half. Perhaps the amount was unremarkable. But the feeling of being paid for your effort, of seeing time turned into currency, felt quietly thrilling. Over time, this feeling becomes more subdued. The checks get larger, but the wonder fades. And in that shift between curiosity and routine is where our story begins. Imagine two boys, barely 9 years old, standing under the tropical sun of Hawaii. One named Robert, the other named Mike. Their shoes scuff the pavement, and their minds whirl with thoughts not of cartoons or candy, but of something adults rarely share with children. How does money really work? They try to make nickels out of melted toothpaste tubes. Their endeavor is innocent, even sweet, a child's interpretation of making money. But behind their hands-on efforts is a deeper question, one that many adults never ask. Is this really how it's done? Their small project is shut down, of course, not by failure, but by law. Yet something awakens, something that will quietly shape how Robert sees the world. Later, they take a job, dusting canned goods, stacking shelves, earning just 10 cents an hour. It's monotonous work, repetitive, predictable, but what begins to nag at Robert isn't the labor, it's the exchange. 10 cents, 3 hours. The math is clear, but something beneath the numbers feels hollow. This feeling, that lingering sense of misalignment, is one many carry but few voice. The work isn't the issue, nor the simplicity of it. What unsettles Robert is the growing awareness that money is not merely the fruit of labor, it is a game of understanding. A system with quiet rules few ever question. His mentor, the man he would call his rich dad, offers no lectures at first. No charts or formulas. Only silence and the opportunity to feel. Weeks pass. No raise comes. No guidance is given. And finally, Robert complains, not about the work, but about the lack of learning. And there it is, the first lesson, tucked gently beneath the irritation. You're sounding just like most of my employees, says Rich Dad. A line like that doesn't sting, it hums, quietly in the back of the mind. Most people work for money. That's not a criticism, it's a simple observation. Bills need paying. Meals need buying, children need shoes and coats and school supplies. And so the cycle begins. Wake up, commute, clock in, clock out, repeat. The reward? A paycheck. But Robert's rich dad suggests something few pause to consider. The moment you work for money, you give up the control. It's not that earning is wrong, but when money becomes the master, when it pulls you toward or pushes you away, Then fear and desire quietly take the reins. Fear of not having enough, desire to have more. Together they form the gears of a machine most never step off. A rat race, as some would later call it. And in the quiet of that idea is a soft realization. Maybe the game isn't about playing harder. Maybe it's about learning how the game is played. Picture, if you will, a small sailboat. A person sits inside, rowing endlessly, believing effort alone determines direction. And for a time this is true, but across the water, another sailor sets a sail. They too move forward, but not by rowing harder, but by learning wind and current, by studying invisible forces. In this story, money is the wind, the sea is the world, and the sail allows movement without the exhaustion. After several Saturdays of unpaid work, Robert and Mike find themselves once more in their mentor's company. "Did you learn anything?" he asks. They aren't sure, but deep inside a shift has occurred, not in what they know, but in what they now want to understand. They no longer wish for more pay. They want to understand what money really is, why it moves the way it does, and how it can be shaped, not just chased. It is a new question, a gentler one, more curious than frustrated, and that is where wisdom begins, not with answers, but with better question. As you rest your head tonight, let this soft question echo, not loudly, but gently, like the lap of water against a quiet dock. If you stopped working for money, what might you start working for instead? Not everything must be answered now. Let that thought settle quietly with you. Let it rest beside you as you drift deeper. Lesson 1. Story 2. The soft trap of comfort and routine. There is a quiet comfort in routine. It asks little of us once we've settled into its rhythm. Wake up at the same time, brew your coffee the same way, check the same inbox, travel the same route, say the same greetings, perform the same tasks, and when the day ends, you are tired, but not always fulfilled. You may call it stability, or you may call it responsibility. Either way, it holds you gently and tightly. Robert's early experience of work, 3 hours for 10 cents, was not about the money, but about the feeling. A slow realization bloomed within him, not all at once, but in fragments. As he moved through repetitive tasks week after week, he began to sense that something was missing. Though it wasn't obvious or dramatic, it was a quiet whisper behind the noise of everyday life. A whisper that said, "There must be more than this." His rich dad, the one who chose to teach through silence and observation rather than lectures, allowed Robert and his friend Mike to feel the dull ache of this realization. He knew the boys would not awaken to the lesson if it was handed to them like a school assignment. Instead, he let them move through it like walking a labyrinth, trusting that the discomfort would point them inward. When Robert finally spoke up, frustrated and ready to quit, his mentor gently pointed out that he was already learning, not in the way school taught with notes and grades, but through emotion, through irritation, boredom, questioning, and reflection. These were the true teachers of life, Rich Dad explained. Life doesn't send messages in neat, underlined passages. It nudges, it waits, it repeats the same lesson until you begin to see it. Most people never do. They find a path early and stick to it, not out of passion, but out of fear. Fear of not having enough. Fear of losing what they have. fear of change, fear of not belonging. Over time, this fear disguises itself as prudence. It becomes the voice that says, "Be grateful for the job, don't rock the boat, it's not worth the risk." And so they stay, not because they love what they do, but because the unknown is heavier than the dissatisfaction they've come to accept. They build lives around paychecks, promotions, and pensions, believing that money will bring safety and that safety will bring peace. But peace rarely comes that way. Not the kind that settles into your bones and softens your breath. The chase for more security, more status, more stuff, only extends the loop. What begins as survival slowly transforms into identity. The job becomes not just a source of income, but a definition of worth. What do you do becomes the question asked at every dinner party, every new introduction, and in answering, we begin to forget who we are beyond our role. Rich Dad pointed out that this comfort, this paycheck-driven life, is one of the most seductive traps. Because it doesn't feel like a trap, it feels reasonable, it feels adult, but it numbs the instinct to grow. It replaces curiosity with caution. The mind that once asked why and what if, now asks, what's the least risky choice? He told Robert, most people will spend their lives working for someone else, not because they can't do more, but because they never question the exchange. They give time for money, without pausing to ask whether time might be worth more than money, or whether money might be made to work in their place. And here lies the gentle pivot of this lesson. Not in rejecting work, but in understanding its purpose. Work is not wrong, effort is not bad, but the purpose matters. If you work only for money, you will spend your days trading your life in small installments. But if you work to learn, to build, to create systems that grow without your constant input, then money becomes a tool rather than a master. Robert was just 9 years old when he began to grasp this. He couldn't yet see the full picture, but something stirred in him, something unspoken. He started to notice how his real dad, the one with the advanced degrees and respected title, still worried about bills, how his conversations were often about security, not freedom, how his achievements, impressive as they were, had not protected him from financial stress. And he noticed something else, how Rich Dad, who didn't have the degrees, seemed calm. Not just about money, but about life. His days were busy, yes, but not rushed, not frantic. He moved with intention, not desperation. This difference wasn't about how much money they had, but about how they related to it. For poor Dad, money was something you earned through hard work, and you held on to it tightly, afraid it would disappear. For Rich Dad, money was something that moved, flowed, grew. It was a river, not a dam, and your job was not to trap it, but to direct it. There's a story Rich Dad liked to tell about a small village that had no clean water source. Every day, 2 men would walk miles to a nearby spring, fill buckets, and return to sell the water. The villagers were grateful, and the men earned a decent living. One of the men, however, began to think differently. He saved some of his earnings and began building a pipeline. It took time. The work was slow. People laughed. But after many months, the pipe was complete. Clean water flowed freely into the village, without the need for buckets. One man still carried pails. The other watched the water flow, day and night, without lifting a finger. This, Rich Dad said, is the difference between working for money and building a system where money works for you. One path rewards you today, the other frees you tomorrow. But few choose the second because the rewards are delayed and the effort feels unseen. We are drawn to applause, to short-term wins, to visible progress. But like planting a tree, true wealth takes root quietly. So much of life's wisdom hides in plain sight. The person who reads by candlelight sees the same words as the one who reads under the sun, but the meaning changes based on the light. And so it is with money. The same dollars can be earned, spent, or invested. The same hours can be traded, saved, or transformed. The difference lies not in the resources, but in the perspective. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavier and your breath softens, consider this gentle thought. Is the routine you follow one you've chosen or one you've settled into? Is it serving your spirit or simply preserving your comfort? There is no need to answer. The question alone may be enough. Lesson 1. Story 3. When money becomes a quiet servant. It is often said that the best tools are the ones you forget you're using. A pen that glides effortlessly across a page, a lamp that gently lights a room, a pair of shoes that carry you far without a single ache. These tools serve without demanding attention. They fade into the background, doing their work quietly, reliably, and with grace. What if money, too, was meant to be this kind of tool? This is the gentle idea Robert's rich dad was nudging him toward. Not to idolize money, not to chase it, not to resent it or worship it, but to understand it deeply enough that it could serve without ruling. Like fire, money can warm or destroy. Like water, it can nourish or flood. But in the hands of someone calm and thoughtful, it becomes something else entirely. A quiet servant. For most people, however, money never becomes quiet. It is loud. It shouts in bank balances. It echoes in overdue notices. It whispers in grocery aisles and rings sharply when rent is due. Even when we believe we have enough, the noise doesn't always fade. It merely shifts in tone. From "will I survive" to "will I be safe" to "will I have enough to stop working someday?" In this way, money never truly sleeps. It paces just outside the mind, always present, always waiting. Rich Dad saw this, and he knew that no amount of income could silence money unless a person changed how they saw it. That's why he taught Robert to question, not just to earn. To wonder, not just to work. In the first few lessons, he wasn't offering financial advice as much as philosophical realignment. He was loosening the grip that money tends to have over the imagination. He began by withdrawing something that most would cling to: wages. For weeks, Robert and Mike worked without pay. At first, this seemed cruel, then absurd, then, finally, curious, because once the expectation of reward was removed, their minds were free to ask better questions. Why am I doing this? What is money anyway? What determines its flow? Who benefits from the system? And most importantly, could that system be reshaped? You see, when you're paid immediately, you rarely stop to study the structure that led to the payment. The paycheck masks the machine. But when payment is delayed, or absent entirely, you begin to see the pipes and gears. You notice how businesses are built, how value is created, how cash flows through channels. That's when the learning truly begins, because it's no longer about compensation, it's about comprehension. Rich Dad explained that most people become skilled at working in systems, but very few understand how to build them. They follow instructions, meet expectations, and rise through ranks, but remain dependent on the very machine they help to run. The moment the paycheck stops, their sense of security evaporates, not because they lack talent, but because they never built an engine of their own. To build such an engine, Rich Dad suggested, one must see money not as a destination, but as a current, like wind through trees or water through channels. You don't chase the wind, you position the sail. You don't command the river, you dig the right grooves. This is where financial intelligence begins, not with budgeting apps or stock tips, but with the soft awareness that money can be shaped, that it has patterns, that it flows toward value, toward leverage, toward design, that with patience and attentiveness, you can begin to guide it. Rich Dad gave them small tasks. Observe how the store made money, who paid for what, how often, what products moved fast, what shelves collected dust, who owned the property, who paid for repairs, who earned income without standing behind a register. These weren't just errands, they were invitations to see deeper. Robert began to notice things he hadn't seen before. Why some businesses failed while others thrived. Why certain investments grew while others withered. He noticed that the most successful people weren't always the ones working the hardest, but the ones who had created something that worked in their place. That's the essence of having money work for you. It doesn't mean you stop working. It means your work creates systems that continue even when you rest, like planting a tree that bears fruit long after your hands leave the soil. In one of their final conversations on this topic, Rich Dad told Robert something he never forgot. If you need to earn more, don't work harder, work wider. The idea was not about laziness or shortcuts. It was about expansion, about creating assets, investments, businesses, intellectual property that could continue producing value over time. This kind of thinking doesn't promise instant results. It's slow, gentle, patient, like turning a large wheel one careful inch at a time. It requires stepping back from the familiar rhythm of work and pay and asking, what am I building? What end does this serve? Could I teach money to work so that one day I could simply think, create, and rest? There's a softness to that vision. Not the harsh clang of hustle, but the quiet hum of grace. Imagine waking up one morning not because the alarm told you to, but because the light slowly filled your room. You stretch, breathe deeply, and move not because you must, but because you choose to. And in the background, the systems you've built hum softly, continuing their work. Quiet, reliable, like the best tools. This doesn't require millions. It begins with perspective, with asking different questions, with learning, slowly, how money behaves when you stop chasing and start listening. Tonight, as your thoughts begin to settle, consider this. What would money look like if it worked for you, quietly, faithfully, like a candle that lit your room without ever flickering, too bright? How would it feel to no longer need to chase or fear it? Just imagine, a quiet servant, not a restless master. Let that picture stay with you, wordless and gentle, as your body softens into sleep. Lesson 2. Why teach financial literacy? This lesson rests on a simple but quietly powerful truth. Income alone does not make you rich. What you keep, and more importantly, what you understand, matters far more. Financial literacy in this light isn't about math or markets. It's about learning to see the difference between appearance and structure, between what makes money and what keeps it. Over the next 3 stories, we'll slow down and reflect on this often overlooked skill. Lesson 2, Story 1. The shape of wealth we cannot see. It's easy to assume that the person with the larger paycheck is wealthier, that the home with more rooms, the car with sleeker lines, or the lifestyle that shines more brightly must represent success. After all, these are the things we can see. They show up in photographs, in stories told at dinner tables, in moments of comparison we don't always mean to entertain. But not everything that looks wealthy is, and not everything that is wealthy shows itself. This is the soft beginning of financial literacy. The ability to read not what's written in bold numbers on a check, but what's quietly hidden between the lines of a life. When Robert was first introduced to this concept, it wasn't through a textbook or a classroom. It was in the contrast between his 2 fathers. One highly educated, respected, and well paid, yet always budgeting, always waiting for payday. The other, less formally educated, but surrounded by properties, businesses, and investments that earned for him even as he slept. One father made a good income, the other built wealth. But wealth, Robert came to understand, isn't loud. It doesn't always wear fine suits or drive brand new cars. In fact, many of those things, while lovely to look at, often belong to people who are quietly carrying debt. Debt that doesn't always shout, but whispers in late-night stress and small hesitations. The kind that turns luxuries into burdens. Rich Dad often said, the rich don't just make money. They understand it. They see its shape, its path, its patterns. This idea stayed with Robert even when he wasn't sure what it meant. Because how does one see money? How does one trace the lines of something that flows, that moves, that is here one moment and gone the next? He learned over time that true financial literacy begins not with knowledge, but with awareness. Like noticing how water runs across a surface, what it soaks into, what it rushes past, what it pools around. Money, too, has tendencies. It leaks out of our lives in ways we don't always feel until the bucket is nearly empty. A streaming subscription here, a frequent dinner out there, a new phone, an upgrade, a sale too good to pass up, not wrong, not shameful, but unnoticed. And this is where literacy matters. Not in judgment, but in sight. When we cannot see where money goes, we lose the ability to guide it. And when we cannot guide it, we live in reaction, hoping that more income will solve the invisible leaks, that a raise will finally give us breathing room, that someday it will all even out. But it rarely does, because the leaks follow us, not because we're careless, but because we were never shown how to see them. Traditional education doesn't teach this. Schools teach how to earn, how to specialize, how to achieve, but they don't often teach how to keep, how to measure, how to grow. That's why Rich Dad insisted on understanding the language of assets and liabilities. Words that sound dry at first, like vocabulary from a balance sheet. But in truth, they are gentle keys to a larger door. An asset, he said, is anything that puts money into your pocket. A liability is anything that takes it out. That's it. Not about price tags or appearances or status, just simple direction. Money in or money out. And so, a car can be either, depending on how it's used. A home, too. Even a job. The question is not whether something is good or bad, but whether it builds you a quiet system of support or quietly drains you over time. When Robert heard this definition for the first time, he didn't fully grasp its power, but over time, as he watched people around him, teachers, doctors, business owners. He began to see the pattern. Many earned well, but spent even better. Their lives looked rich, but their money flowed outward like water from a cracked jug. They held nothing back for themselves, not out of generosity, but out of habit. He thought back to a neighbor who had once won a small lottery prize. The family upgraded everything: new appliances, new wardrobes, a vacation. For a while, the house glowed, but the money was gone within a year. Because the pattern hadn't changed. The literacy was never learned. And so, the wealth evaporated, like mist under the sun. Rich Dad believed this didn't need to happen. Not if we could teach people, gently, patiently, to see, to notice the quiet exchanges they make each day, to pause before saying, I can afford the payments, and instead ask, will this support me or require my support? In this way, financial literacy is not unlike reading the weather. You can't control the rain, but you can prepare. You can plant in the right season, carry an umbrella, fix the roof before the storm. And so too with money. When you begin to see its flow, you move with grace instead of resistance. You guide instead of react. It starts small. A single expense examined. A new habit formed. A new thought. Does this build something for me? Over time, these small moments create a foundation, not of restriction, but of freedom. Because freedom doesn't come from spending without thought. It comes from knowing that your choices today are quietly building a tomorrow that needs less effort, not more. Tonight, as your thoughts slow and your breath deepens, consider this simple question, not to answer now, but just to hold softly. What in my life quietly adds to me, and what quietly takes away? Let that question rest beside you, like a gentle companion in the dark. Thank you, let's continue, gently deepening our understanding of this quiet, essential subject. Lesson 2. Story 2. The house that costs you quietly. In many places, a home is considered the greatest achievement. It's the symbol of having made it, of belonging, of success, of permanence. We speak of owning a home with reverence, as if the deed alone grants peace, dignity, and a kind of security that can't be found elsewhere. And yet, sometimes, what feels like an asset quietly behaves like a liability. Robert's rich dad offered a perspective that startled him at first. He said, "Your house is not an asset unless it puts money in your pocket." It was one of those statements that doesn't make sense until you sit with it for a while. And even then it feels uncomfortable, like hearing that a lifelong friend might not have your best interests at heart. How could something so cherished, so meaningful, so full of memories be a financial burden? But Rich Dad wasn't trying to be cruel. He wasn't asking Robert to love his home any less. He was simply asking him to notice, to observe what the home was doing, not emotionally, but financially. This, he said, is what financial literacy allows you to do, to gently separate feelings from functions, to acknowledge that something can bring joy and still cost you quietly month after month, year after year, that owning something doesn't always mean controlling it, that some things we work for actually make us work more. Robert began to see it. His poor dad, despite being well-educated and hard-working, spent a large portion of his income maintaining their home, mortgage payments, property taxes, repairs, upgrades. The home was comfortable, but it consumed resources. It never gave anything back financially, and yet it was praised as the greatest investment he had ever made. The problem wasn't that the home was bad. It was that it was misunderstood. Rich Dad explained it this way. An asset puts money into your pocket even when you're not working. A rental property with tenants. A dividend-generating stock. A small business that runs while you sleep. These are things that with time give more than they take. A personal home, on the other hand, often asks for maintenance, upgrades, insurance, interest, without returning cash flow. It may appreciate in value, yes, but until it does, it quietly subtracts. And so if you call it an investment, you may begin to expect it to behave like one, and when it doesn't, you feel disappointed or confused. But if you see it for what it is, a personal expense with emotional value, you can begin to make other choices to truly build wealth. This distinction isn't taught often. Most people learn to see big purchases as symbols of financial progress. A bigger home means you're doing well. A new car means you've moved up. But Rich Dad challenged Robert to ask, is this thing helping me earn, or is it asking me to spend? The answer was never moral. It wasn't about guilt or pride, it was simply practical. He told Robert, love your home, live in it, fill it with warmth, but don't confuse it with a wealth-building asset, unless it's also working for you in some way. This was hard to hear at first. We all want to believe that the things we cherish are helping us, that effort equals progress. But progress doesn't always come from effort. It comes from direction. And direction, financially, means understanding the quiet impact of the things we own. There's a metaphor Rich Dad liked, the house as a pet. It's loyal. It gives you comfort. But it also needs to be fed, groomed, protected. The bigger the pet, the more care it requires. And if you have many of them, you may find yourself working just to feed them. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have them. It simply means we should know what they are and plan accordingly. Robert began to see how so many people spent their lives upgrading their homes, believing they were investing when, in fact, they were simply increasing their monthly expenses. More rooms to cool, more space to clean, more taxes to pay. Again, not wrong, but not wealth building. He saw how this pattern played out over decades. Families bought the biggest homes they could afford. They worked harder to furnish them, to maintain them, to keep up with expectations. And in the process, they sometimes neglected to build real assets, things that earned, things that could have bought them time, flexibility, and ease later on. Financial literacy, then, isn't about depriving yourself of comfort. It's about understanding the difference between comfort that feeds you and comfort that drains you. A small house that lets you invest more in your future may serve you better than a large one that consumes all your potential. A modest lifestyle with space to build assets may create more peace than a luxurious one built on fragile margins. This is not something society teaches. In fact, the opposite is true. You are rewarded, often praised, for spending, for showing outward signs of wealth. But true wealth is often invisible. It lives in freedom, in time, in the ability to walk away or to say no. It lives in knowing that your life costs less than it earns, and that the difference grows quietly. Robert eventually came to understand this. He didn't reject the idea of home ownership, but he learned to view it clearly, to distinguish between emotional value and financial return, and to make sure that elsewhere in his life he was quietly building assets, things that worked while he rested. Tonight, as your day winds down and your thoughts grow soft, you might let this question float quietly in your mind. Is what I own gently supporting me, or quietly asking for more of me? Let the question rest there, unanswered, like a quiet companion, the kind that asks nothing but keeps you company as you drift towards sleep. Thank you. Now let's bring this lesson to a close with one last reflection. Quietly and carefully. Lesson 2, Story 3, A River, a Bucket, and a Balance Sheet. There's a soft story Rich Dad liked to share. Not from a textbook or financial news, but from a quiet village beside a river. Long ago, 2 men were hired to carry water from the river to the village each morning. They each used wooden buckets and made several trips a day. At first the job was tiring but rewarding. They were paid well, praised by villagers, and grateful for the work. Over time, one man grew weary. There must be a better way, he thought. While he continued hauling buckets, he quietly began working on something else. A small pipe. It took years. He used his savings. The work was unnoticed and often mocked. But eventually, the pipe was complete. Now, water flowed steadily from the river to the village, even while he rested. The other man still carried his buckets. This story isn't about labor or intelligence. It's about seeing something most never stop to consider. Effort alone doesn't build freedom. Systems do. And in finances, those systems are called assets. Robert didn't learn this idea in school. It wasn't in his textbooks. Instead, he learned it through his rich dad's patient teachings. How to read a balance sheet. Not as a corporate tool, but as a personal mirror. A way to look quietly and truthfully at your own financial river. A balance sheet, at its simplest, shows what you own and what you owe, assets and liabilities. That's all. But it's what those numbers represent that matters. It's the shape of your life's foundation. In the beginning, Robert's sheet was nearly empty. A small amount of savings, no real assets. But Rich Dad encouraged him not to be discouraged, only to be aware. Because awareness is where change begins. When you understand what feeds your future and what drains it, you begin to act with intention. You stop reacting and start adjusting. One of the first things Rich Dad taught him was this: never confuse income with wealth. Many people earn well, but spend just as well. Their income column is full, but their asset column is thin. And so, despite years of effort, they remain vulnerable. One lost job, one emergency, one disruption, and the entire system wobbles. But a person with modest income and a strong asset base, steady rental income, long-held investments, intellectual property, or even a small business, has something else entirely. Time, flexibility, options not because they work harder, but because they built something that doesn't need them every hour of the day. This was a quiet revelation, because in the culture Robert was raised in, success looked like more money, a bigger title, a faster car. But Rich Dad offered a different lens. Success, he said softly, is when your assets cover your expenses and you are no longer bound to earn. It sounds simple, but reaching that point where your river flows steadily on its own requires something the bucket system never offers: vision, delayed gratification, and a quiet understanding of financial flow. Robert was taught to track everything, not obsessively but attentively. He learned to ask questions. Does this purchase build an asset or is it a liability? Does this expense support something that will grow? He didn't stop enjoying life, but he began planting seeds. A small investment here, a learning opportunity there. He didn't try to rush the process. He simply kept adding to the pipeline. And slowly, the balance sheet began to change, not just in size, but in shape. Less weight on the liability side, more quiet strength on the asset side. Over time, this created a shift in how he lived. He could say yes more freely. He could say no without fear. He could take risks others couldn't. Not because he was brave, but because he had a safety net he had quietly woven himself. Rich Dad often reminded him it's not about being rich, it's about being stable, calm, unburdened. And so, financial literacy wasn't about spreadsheets or wealth accumulation, it was about creating calm in one's life. A rhythm of earning, saving, building, and noticing. A gentler relationship with money. One where you don't chase it, but invite it, direct it, and let it work. The balance sheet became not a source of anxiety, but a place of grounding, a quiet page that whispered, "Here is where you are, and here is where you're headed." And that awareness, Robert came to realize, was itself a form of wealth. As we close this lesson, think of your own financial life, not in terms of lack or comparison, but as a river. Where does it flow? Where does it leak? What small structure could you begin to build, not overnight, but slowly? Could it be knowledge, a habit, a new way of tracking your life? You don't need to build a dam, just a small channel, a quiet stream, something that continues while you rest. Tonight, let this image rest beside you. Single drop, turning into a stream. Lesson 3. Mind your own business. This lesson speaks not to selfishness or detachment, but to clarity, to the quiet decision to build something that belongs to you, not just a title on a business card or a salary from someone else's dream, but a foundation of your own. It reminds us that even while we work for others, we can slowly grow our own garden, our own business. Over the next 3 stories, we'll explore this idea softly, patiently, and with care. Story 1. The Garden Beyond the Job. Oh, there's something timeless about tending a garden. You plant, you water, you wait. You can't force it. You can't rush it. You must simply care for it. Consistently, attentively, and without expectation that tomorrow will bear fruit. But one day, almost unexpectedly, it does. In much the same way, Rich Dad encouraged Robert to think of building his own business not as a dramatic leap, but as a quiet tending, something done slowly, on the side while others remain focused on jobs alone. Mind your own business, he would say. Not to be dismissive, but to be deliberate. It meant, even as you work for others, do not forget to work for yourself. Even as you earn a paycheck, keep growing something of your own. The idea was simple. Your job may pay the bills, but it rarely sets you free. Jobs offer income, structure, routine, and for many they offer meaning, but they do not usually offer ownership. And ownership, over time, is what builds wealth. Rich Dad wasn't telling Robert to quit or rebel. He wasn't dismissing jobs as useless. He was simply asking a different question. While you're working for others, are you also quietly building something for yourself? It could be anything: a side business, a small portfolio, a creative endeavor, intellectual property, a rental, a skill that could one day turn into income. It didn't need to be big. It just needed to be planted and watered little by little. Robert noticed early on that most people became so focused on their jobs that they forgot to look beyond them. Promotions became the goal, raises became the reward, and when those stopped coming, so did the sense of progress. They were gardeners tending someone else's field. He also saw how fragile this arrangement could be. One downturn, one corporate decision, one illness, and the job could vanish, taking with it not just income, but identity. Without another foundation, people felt lost. That's why Rich Dad taught him to think of his financial life like two tracks running parallel. One was employment, the job that paid today's bills. The other was ownership, the quiet building of assets that might one day remove the need for the first. Even if you never planned to leave your job, the second track gave you options. And options, he said, were a kind of freedom. He encouraged Robert to spend less time worrying about promotions and more time thinking about passive income. You can have both, he'd say, but never forget which one is yours. The difference wasn't always visible. A person working a job and investing on the side looks very similar to someone just working a job. But over years, the gap widens. The one who owns assets gains breathing room. Their income continues even if the job doesn't. Their future is shaped not by others' decisions but their own. Robert began his own garden early. Small ventures, investments, even just reading, learning, imagining. It wasn't dramatic, but it was his. It gave him something to return to after work, something to look forward to beyond the paycheck. Rich Dad used a soft metaphor. Your job is like a faucet. You turn it on, water flows, but the moment you stop turning, the water stops. Your own business, though, it's a well. It takes longer to build. You must dig. But once it's ready, the water rises on its own. This didn't mean everyone needed to be an entrepreneur in the traditional sense. Not everyone needs to run a company or manage a staff. But everyone, he believed, could build a small system that earned while they rested. That, over time, could support them gently. The lesson here isn't urgency, it's patience. Just as no garden grows overnight, no business blooms without care. It begins with noticing. What are your interests, your skills? What small assets could you begin to build? Could you buy a single stock and watch it grow? Create something once that sells again and again? Rent out a room or a tool or a service? These small seeds, over time, become something strong. Robert noticed something else, too. The people who built something of their own often had a different energy. They worried less. Not because they were richer, but because they had taken quiet responsibility for their lives. They knew where their foundation lay. They trusted it. They weren't waiting to be chosen, promoted, or rescued. Instead, they watered their own gardens. Every day. Without spectacle. Just small, consistent care. Tonight, as your day winds down, consider this gentle image. A small patch of earth. Yours. What could you plant in it, not for tomorrow, but for years from now? What might begin to grow, slowly, without noise? You don't need to decide tonight, but let the image remain with you. Soft, green, full of potential. Thank you. Let's continue with the second story in Lesson 3, unfolding the idea of building something that works quietly in the background of your life. Story 2, the shelf that grows while you sleep. Imagine a shelf tucked into the corner of a quiet room. On it sits something you've made, a small book, a hand-painted bowl, a recorded song, a simple course, a page of code. At first, it gathers dust. It does nothing. It sits. But one day, someone notices. They purchase it. Then someone else. Then again. And while you sleep, or walk, or sip tea on a still morning, you earn. This is the shelf Rich Dad wanted Robert to build. Not a literal shelf, but a metaphor for assets. Small, thoughtful things that don't need constant tending. Things that give back long after the effort has passed. Build shelves, he used to say. Put things on them that earn while you rest. In a world where so much of our time is traded for money, this idea can feel foreign. Most people are taught that income comes from action. Show up, clock in, complete the task. And it does, but only as long as you keep showing up. If you pause, so does the income. It's a system built on presence. Assets, however, shift that equation. They're like echoes. You say something once and it keeps speaking. You do the work once and it keeps giving. A book keeps selling. A rental keeps collecting. A video keeps teaching. A share keeps growing. You don't need to be present, just patient. Robert began to notice how different people thought about time. His poor dad filled his schedule, always working, always striving. His income was respectable, but linear. One effort, one paycheck. His rich dad, on the other hand, used his time differently. He spent it building things that continued without him. Businesses with managers, investments with compound returns, properties with tenants. None of it was overnight. But over years it became something steady. Rich Dad explained that this is the quiet difference between the employed and the owner. One trades hours, the other builds systems. One shows up, the other designs. And slowly, the second begins to earn more, not because they work harder, but because they work from a different foundation. This foundation often begins with understanding a simple concept, the difference between being busy and being productive. Many of us stay busy. Our calendars are full, our days are long, but how much of that time is spent on things that will still serve us a year from now, 5 years, 10? Robert learned to ask, will this work still matter later? Will it continue to give? If not, that didn't make it worthless, but it meant it wasn't an asset. And if too much of your time is spent on things that vanish the moment you stop, your life becomes a constant push, never quite catching up. That's why Rich Dad encouraged him to carve out time for the shelf. Even if it's just an hour a week, he'd say. Even if all you do is research, or write, or learn. Over time, that shelf could hold something meaningful. Robert began small. He invested in used comic books and resold them for a margin. Later, he helped manage small rental units. Eventually, he invested in intellectual property, things people could use, learn from, return to. It wasn't glamorous, but slowly the shelf filled, and that shelf became something deeply valuable: freedom. Not the dramatic kind, where you walk out of a job with flair, but the quiet kind, where you can breathe, where you can take a break, or say no, or choose a slower pace. Not because you've stopped working, but because your shelf keeps working for you. In time, Robert realized that many people had the same number of hours, but different outcomes. The ones who owned shelves didn't panic when layoffs came. They weren't afraid of missing a paycheck. They knew they had built something that could hold them. This doesn't mean everyone should be an investor or a creator or a landlord, but everyone can build a shelf. It begins with one question: what could I do once that might help me again and again? It might be a digital product, a piece of writing, a rental, a skill you can license, a course, a design, even a habit like investing regularly in dividend-paying stocks. Small things, repeated patiently. The hardest part, Robert learned, wasn't money, it was belief. Belief that something slow could matter. That quiet work, done in the margins, could reshape a life. That shelves, once filled, could one day hold not just income, but peace. We are not taught to value slow work. We are rewarded for urgency, for hustle, for results now. But the best shelves take time. They take thought. They take seasons of silence. And so, if you find yourself working all the time and still feeling behind, it may not be your effort that's the issue. It may be the structure, the absence of a shelf, the lack of a system that serves you back. As we close this story, think of your own life. Is there something, however small, you could place on a shelf? Something that could earn while you sleep? Something that asks nothing more than care and consistency? Let that thought sit with you. No urgency, no expectation, just the quiet image of a shelf in a sunlit room, slowly filling with things that will one day help you rest. Thank you. Let's now bring Lesson 3 to a gentle close with a final story about ownership. Not of a business alone, but of a life, shaped by slow intention and quiet agency. Story 3, a name on the door, a life of your own. In a quiet town, down a side street with faded signs and flowering trees, there is a little workshop. It's not large. You could walk past it and not notice, but on the glass door, written in small lettering, is a name. A real name. The name of the person who built what's inside. And that, more than anything else, makes the place feel different, because it isn't just a job, it's a choice. It's a place they made, shaped, and grew. Rich Dad told Robert many times that putting your name on the door isn't about ego, it's about responsibility. It's a quiet declaration. This I have built. This I tend. This I own. It doesn't matter if it's a shop, a website, a creative portfolio, or a spreadsheet of investments, the principle is the same. It belongs to you. And that ownership changes everything. When you work for others, you contribute, but the reward is fixed, and the control is limited. The shape of your day, your future, and even your value is often determined by someone else. But when you work on something that is yours, even just a little, a part of your life becomes yours again. Robert began to see this distinction early. His poor dad had a steady job with clear rules, He was proud of his role in education and the impact he made. But when the system shifted, when politics changed, when budgets tightened, he had little say. His path was determined by a machine he did not own. His rich dad, in contrast, owned small businesses, real estate, and intellectual property. His days weren't always easy. He faced stress, uncertainty, risk, but he also had a kind of internal steadiness. He knew that no one could take away what he had built. If something failed, he had others. If one door closed, he could open another. That was the difference. It wasn't about never failing, it was about not needing permission to start again. Rich Dad taught that even a modest business, even something that earned little at first, was a step toward sovereignty. When you build something of your own, he said, you learn differently, you think differently, you walk into the world differently. This idea wasn't just about money, it was about mindset. When you own something, you don't wait to be picked. You pick yourself. You become both student and teacher, both apprentice and master. You begin to think about how things work, not just how to do them, but how to design them. Robert found that people who owned their work, in any form, were more engaged, more thoughtful. They asked better questions. They paid attention to details others ignored. Not because they were smarter, but because they were connected. This was theirs. And that changed everything. Even people with traditional jobs could adopt this mindset. Teachers who built courses that could be sold online. Mechanics who recorded videos and earned through views. Designers who sold templates. Writers who published short guides. Consultants who packaged their knowledge into repeatable systems. Each one had, in some quiet way, put their name on the door. Ownership didn't require an office. It required intention. And so, Robert came to see that financial freedom wasn't about escaping work. It was about changing the relationship to it. When the work is yours, you can shape it. When the income is passive, you can rest. When the business is aligned with your life, you don't feel torn between meaning and money. This is not always easy. It takes time to build something of your own. You may have to wake early or stay late. You may have to fail gently, again and again, until the form emerges. But the payoff is quiet and lasting. You gain the ability to breathe more freely, to choose. Ownership also teaches resilience. When the world changes, and it always does, those who have built for themselves adapt more easily. They understand how value is created, where opportunities arise, how systems can bend and stretch. They don't just do tasks, they see patterns. That is the gift of minding your own business. Not wealth alone, but wisdom. Not just control, but clarity. As this lesson closes, consider what you might build, not for scale or status, but for meaning, for steadiness, for the quiet satisfaction of seeing your own name in some way on the work you've shaped. It could be a small venture, a tiny side income, a project, an investment, or even a system for how your money flows. The shape doesn't matter. The ownership does. And tonight, as your eyes begin to close, hold this soft image. A door. A name. A light still glowing after hours. And behind that door, something you've built, not for show, not for applause, but for the simple, quiet truth that it is yours. Thank you. Let's now step gently into Lesson 4, perhaps the most surprising lesson so far, not because of complexity, but because of what it quietly reveals, that systems shape outcomes more than effort alone. Lesson 4: The History of Taxes and the Power of Corporations. This lesson doesn't ask us to become tax experts or legal scholars. Instead, it invites us to look beneath the surface of how money flows in society, how laws, rules, and entities like corporations were designed not only to manage business, but to protect and empower those who understand them. Over the next 3 stories, we'll explore this lesson, not as a debate about fairness, but as a soft unveiling of something easily missed: how structure quietly shapes reality. Lesson 4, Story 1, The Hidden Rules Beneath the Game. Imagine a board game, not one you've played before, but one already in progress. The board is filled with tokens, some stacked high, some barely moving. You sit down, eager to play, and begin moving your piece with care. You think you're doing well, but slowly a strange pattern emerges. Some players seem to leap ahead without effort. Others, like you, work hard just to stay in place. Something feels off. You ask a quiet question: are there rules I don't know? Rich Dad believed that most people go through life like this, playing a game they were never properly taught. Not because they're incapable, but because no one ever showed them the rule book. They're told to work hard, pay taxes, and save. But they aren't taught how the system actually works beneath the surface, how money moves differently for those who use different tools. One of those tools, he explained gently, is the corporation. When Robert was a boy, he thought corporations were for big companies, skyscrapers, suits, and boardrooms. But Rich Dad saw them differently. To him, they were not symbols of power. They were shelters, shields, quiet tools that let people direct their money differently. Most people earn, then pay taxes, then spend what's left, Rich Dad said. But if you own a corporation, you can earn, spend, and then pay taxes only on what's left. It was a small shift in order, but a massive shift in outcome. At first, Robert didn't understand. How could structure matter more than effort? Why should someone who worked hard and followed the rules struggle more than someone who owned a corporation? Rich Dad wasn't justifying it, he was revealing it. The rules aren't hidden, he said. They're just not taught. You have to look for them. Over time, Robert saw the truth of this. The tax code was filled with incentives, not just punishments. It rewarded certain behaviors: investing in housing, creating jobs, building infrastructure, offering services. And corporations were a way to participate in those rewards. For example, a small business owner could deduct expenses, vehicles, equipment, meals related to business. They could set up retirement accounts, health plans, all before calculating taxes. Not loopholes, not tricks, just structures. Structures that anyone could use, but few were taught. Rich Dad often compared this to sailing. The wind blows on everyone, he'd say, but those who know how to set their sails go farther. The system wasn't always fair, but it was navigable, if you took the time to learn. And so financial literacy in this lesson became not just about numbers, but about awareness of structure. It was about noticing how rules shape outcomes, how systems direct flow, how the game isn't just about playing hard, but about playing wisely. Robert began studying this quietly. He didn't rush to form companies or chase tax shelters. He just started asking better questions. How is this income taxed? How could this expense be managed differently? What structure would give me more flexibility? The answers didn't come quickly, but they came. Over time, he saw a pattern. The people who succeeded financially weren't always the smartest or hardest working. They were the ones who took the time to understand the rules that others ignored. This wasn't about greed, it was about stewardship, about guiding your resources carefully, legally, intentionally, like planting a tree in good soil, like building a house with the right foundation. Not flashy, just wise. Rich Dad never pressured Robert to take shortcuts. In fact, he warned against anything that felt dishonest or rushed. The system is complex, he said, but you don't need to master it all. Just learn one piece at a time. Then use that piece with care. One of those pieces was the corporation, not just as a legal entity, but as a mindset. It asked, what am I building? Who owns it? What structure would protect and support it? These weren't urgent questions, but they were grounding ones. And so, Robert came to understand that success wasn't just about effort or talent. It was also about environment, about choosing the right tools, walking through the right doors, asking the right kinds of questions. He thought back to the board game analogy. He wasn't angry at those who moved ahead. He just wanted to understand how. And once he did, he realized he could move differently too. Not because the game got easier, but because he finally understood the rules beneath the surface. Tonight, as you settle into stillness, ask yourself, not urgently, not analytically, but softly, are there rules I've been playing by that I never truly saw? Let that question drift gently through your thoughts. Thank you. Let's continue deeper into the quiet structure of this lesson, into a story about the strange magic of masks and how what we wear in the eyes of the law can gently shape the way we're treated. Lesson 4, Story 2, The Mask That Earns for You. When you were a child, you may have worn a mask during play. Maybe it made you feel brave or invisible or powerful in ways your small self wasn't yet sure how to be. And when the game ended, you took it off, gently returning to your truest self. But even as children, we understood something about masks. They changed how we were seen. And sometimes they changed how we behaved too. Rich Dad believed a corporation was a kind of grown-up mask, not a disguise, but a formal costume worn in the legal and financial theater of the world. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't spiritual, but it was practical. You are still you, he'd say, but when you wear the mask of a company, the system sees you differently. It treats you differently, and that changes the way the game unfolds. This was hard for Robert to understand at first. He was taught, like many of us, that fairness lived in effort, that the person who worked hardest should win, that the system would reward goodness. But slowly he came to see that the financial system didn't operate like a fairy tale. It operated like a machine, with inputs, outputs, levers, and forms. And the corporate entity was one of its most powerful levers. Here's what he learned. As an individual, you are taxed before you can spend. You earn your income. Then taxes are removed. Then you're left to spend what's left. But as a corporation, it works differently. The corporation earns, then spends on its operations, then pays taxes on what remains. This small difference, this one shift in order, creates enormous space. It's the reason some businesses can deduct travel, meals, vehicles, equipment, and training, not because they're doing anything wrong, but because the system was designed to reward business activity. It wants job creation. It wants investment. It wants commerce. So it allows the corporate entity to spend first, because that spending stimulates the economy. This is the soft power of the mask. It doesn't make you invincible. It doesn't remove all responsibility, but it does change your position in the system. And this position, Rich Dad said, could be used wisely. Not to manipulate, not to dodge, but to shape your life differently. To use the system the way it was quietly designed to be used. Robert began to notice something. The people who wore the corporate mask, who took the time to understand it, often had more room in their lives. Not always more money at first, but more room, more flexibility, more control over how their income moved, how it was protected, how it was taxed. This mask also had protective qualities. If someone sued the business, the person was often shielded. If the business struggled, the person could walk away, perhaps bruised but not destroyed. The legal line between the entity and the individual gave breathing room. But it was more than protection. It was structure. It encouraged thinking like a builder, not just a worker. It forced attention to detail, to systems, to tracking, to decision-making. It turned casual effort into formal creation. You didn't just earn, you structured. You didn't just work, you documented. The business became its own small world, and that, in turn, gave birth to something rare, compounding freedom. Over time, Robert saw the emotional shift this caused. People who used corporations wisely often felt less frantic. Not because they never struggled, but because they had tools. They had space. They had a mask they could wear that let them play a different role. That's what Rich Dad meant when he said, "Don't just work in the system. Learn to work with the system." A job, even a good one, is only one costume. A corporation is another. Each lets you play a different part, and when you learn to wear both, you begin to see the whole stage. Robert also learned that corporations didn't have to be large or complicated. A small LLC, a sole proprietorship with structure, a holding company for investments. These weren't just tools for the wealthy. They were tools for anyone willing to learn. The key was intention. Are you building something? Offering something? Managing risk? Creating value? Then perhaps it's time to give your work a costume that fits. This isn't taught in most schools, not because it's hidden, but because the system prefers simplicity. It's easier to manage employees than entrepreneurs, easier to reward obedience than structure. But that doesn't mean you can't choose differently. Financial literacy in this context becomes a quiet kind of empowerment. You don't have to shout. You don't have to resist. You simply choose differently. You act from knowledge, not assumption. You move from understanding, not fear. And in that understanding, something soft and strong emerges. Ownership of your path. As Robert's journey unfolded, he realized that the corporate mask wasn't a betrayal of his values. It was an expression of them. It allowed him to earn with integrity, to structure his work in a way that protected his family, to build systems that would last longer than his own effort. It was, in many ways, a gift he could pass on, not in money alone, but in wisdom, in teaching others how to wear the mask well. Tonight, as your breath slows and your mind settles, imagine this quiet idea. What if there were ways of being seen, not for who you are, but for what you've built? What if wearing the right mask could make the world move differently around you? Let that thought drift beside you, like a light fabric floating through the night. Thank you. Now let us bring Lesson 4 to a peaceful close, not with a lesson about money alone, but about bridges, the ones we quietly build between effort and ease, risk and resilience, work and freedom. Lesson 4, Story 3, A Bridge Between Effort and Freedom. There is a story, quiet and old, of a traveler who lived between two lands. On one side, the place of labor, of early mornings, long days, and the humble satisfaction of honest work. On the other side, the place of freedom, of rest, of time, of space to think and create. But between these lands was a wide river, impossible to cross by chance. So the traveler began to build a bridge. He did not build it all at once. At first it was only a plank, placed carefully by hand, then another, and another. Each day, before or after work, he laid down one more board. Some days he questioned whether the other shore was real, but still he built, quietly, without rush, until one day the path beneath him reached the other side. This is how Rich Dad explained the power of corporations and structured wealth, not as shortcuts, but as bridges between effort and freedom. Robert came to understand that effort alone wasn't always enough, that many people labored endlessly but remained tethered to the same place, not because they lacked discipline or dreams, but because their path had no bridge. They were locked in a system that taxed them first, restricted them next, and protected them last. The corporation, then, was not merely a legal structure. It was a tool, a bridge builder, a system that allowed value to be created, protected, directed, before it was diminished by tax or lost to liability. Build a bridge, Rich Dad would say softly, one that carries your work across time. He didn't mean this in the way of corporations as empires or corporate life as identity. He meant it gently. Build something that outlives your hours, that holds your effort in form, that allows your money to move with intention, not merely reaction. Corporations, he taught, are recognized by the system. They can own property, enter agreements, pay expenses, and be taxed, not as people, but as entities. That means you can separate your personal life from your financial engine. It's like putting your resources in a boat instead of swimming across the river with them. This separation creates freedom, not just financial, but mental. When your life and your work are tied too tightly together, every risk feels personal. Every challenge touches your home. But when you build a bridge, a business, an investment structure, an entity that carries the weight, you remain whole, even when the world shifts. Robert saw this many times. People who worked hard their entire lives but had nothing to show at the end. Not because they failed, but because they never built a system to hold their work. Their energy leaked out as fast as it came in. He saw others too, those who built carefully. A small business that paid them while they traveled. A corporation that owned their investments. A structure that allowed them to pass on wealth cleanly, quietly. The difference was not brilliance. It was simply one built a bridge, the other kept swimming. This lesson, then, is not a call to complexity. It's an invitation to form. To look at your financial life and ask, where am I still carrying everything on my back? Where could I build a system to carry it instead? You don't need to know the entire design tonight. You only need to place the first board. That might be learning about a business structure, speaking to someone who's done it, asking new questions about how your income flows, or simply noticing for the first time that the river exists. Rich Dad reminded Robert often, freedom isn't found in escape, it's found in structure, a system that works while you rest, that earns while you dream, that carries your work forward after you've stopped walking. This is what a corporation or an asset or a wise financial framework can do. It is a bridge between effort and freedom, a structure that whispers, you don't have to carry it all. As this story ends, let the image settle beside you, a wooden bridge in the moonlight, quiet, unfinished, but there, reaching softly toward the other side. Lesson 5. The rich invent money. This lesson isn't about cleverness or risk-taking. It's about recognizing possibility, especially where others see only limits. It shows that those with financial intelligence can find opportunity, not by having more resources, but by seeing differently. And that ability, Robert learned, could be nurtured quietly, thoughtfully, and over time. In the next 3 stories, we'll explore how this invention unfolds, not through chaos, but through calm awareness. Lesson 5. Story 1. The window that wasn't there. There is a quiet moment many of us have felt. We walk into a room, a problem, a situation, a life path, and it feels closed. Every door has been tried. Every window is locked. And so we sit down, believing there's nothing more to be done. But once in a while, someone walks in and notices a panel, a seam, a small crack in the wall, and through it a window that wasn't there. Or so we thought. Rich Dad told Robert often, opportunity is not always something you find. Sometimes it's something you notice, or something you create. This was one of the most important lessons of his financial education. That wealth isn't always inherited or earned. Sometimes it is invented. That didn't mean made-up money or risky bets. It meant seeing something invisible to others. A property undervalued. A business model unnoticed. A need unspoken. And quietly shaping something around it. Robert saw this happen again and again. 2 people would walk into the same situation. One would see a wall. The other would see an opening. Not because it was easier for the second person, but because they had trained their mind to look differently. Financial education, Rich Dad believed, was like learning to see in low light. You don't suddenly have night vision, but over time, your eyes adjust. You see outlines, possibilities, movement. This is where invention begins. It might look like buying a rundown property others ignore, then restoring it with intention, or creating a service for a need no one has noticed yet, or finding a way to combine existing things in a way that feels new. Robert once saw Rich Dad buy a small shop that others had overlooked. The numbers didn't impress. The neighborhood was quiet. But Rich Dad saw something different. He saw a growing population nearby. He saw a need for services. He saw what could be, not just what was. He made small changes, shifted the products, adjusted the hours, improved the signage. The shop slowly came to life. It didn't make headlines, but it created income. And that income created more opportunity. This was the invention of money. Not from thin air, but from thin observation. A noticing, a shaping, a patience. Robert began to see that people often waited for opportunity to come to them. They looked for obvious signs, a job offer, a raise, a tip. But invention asks something else. It asks you to be curious, to be calm, to look deeper. He also saw that invention required trust, not just in markets, but in yourself. The belief that you could build something even when others didn't see it yet, that you could walk toward a window even when the world said the wall was solid. That trust didn't come from arrogance. It came from understanding. The more Robert learned about money, about systems, about people, the more his confidence grew, not loudly, but inwardly. And this quiet confidence allowed him to move when others froze. In times of uncertainty, most people retreat. But the ones who have practiced seeing, who have trained their mind to look for openings, move carefully forward. They ask soft questions. What is changing? What is being overlooked? What do people need now that they didn't need before? From these questions, new paths emerge. This doesn't mean every invention leads to wealth. Some fail, some take time, but the practice itself becomes valuable. You stop waiting, you start creating. Rich Dad encouraged Robert to develop this, not through risk, but through awareness. He didn't need to jump blindly into ventures. He needed to observe, to study, to ask different questions than those around him. That's why he read, why he listened, why he paid attention to things others ignored, like zoning laws, tax changes, migration trends, shifting technologies. Not as a chore, but as a quiet way to sharpen the lens. And slowly the windows appeared. You may have noticed this in your own life, a time when you saw something others didn't, when you noticed an opportunity to help, to solve, to build. Maybe you didn't follow it, maybe you did. Either way, you felt it, that subtle difference between seeing and truly seeing. That is invention. And it can be nurtured like a slow-growing vine. Not all of us will create businesses, but all of us can invent value in our homes, our work, our habits, our investments, our way of seeing the world. And when we do, something changes. The world feels less fixed, less closed. You begin to realize the game isn't waiting to be played, it's waiting to be rewritten. Tonight, as the world quiets and your breath deepens, let this gentle idea rest beside you. What if the window is already there, just waiting to be noticed? Thank you. Let's continue now, slowly and with care, into a story about how something can come from almost nothing. not through force, but through gentle observation, quiet thought, and the kind of slow courage that begins not in action, but in attention. Lesson 5, Story 2. The quiet art of making something out of nothing. There is a kind of quiet magic in turning nothing into something, not through sleight of hand, but through awareness. A baker makes bread from flour and water. A gardener grows beauty from soil and seed. A poet shapes meaning from silence. These are not tricks. They are transformations, and they are not limited to art or craft. They live in money too. Rich Dad taught Robert that financial opportunity didn't require wealth to begin. It required understanding, and from understanding, resourcefulness could emerge. You don't need more money, he often said. You need to think differently about the money you already have. At first, this felt confusing. How could you create wealth without wealth? But over time, Robert began to see what Rich Dad meant. It wasn't about creating something from nothing. It was about creating something from what others thought was nothing. An idea, a piece of information, a connection, a small loan, a neglected asset, a few saved dollars, and a better plan. Robert watched this in practice. He once saw Rich Dad negotiate the use of a vacant lot to host weekend markets. He didn't buy the land, he didn't build anything, he simply offered value to the landowner, to the vendors, to the customers. Everyone benefited, and from that income was born. Another time, he watched him purchase a struggling small business, not with cash, but with terms, payments over time, built into the performance of the business itself. Again, it was not about having large capital up front. It was about seeing differently. These weren't schemes. They were soft uses of the imagination, a reordering of possibilities, a gentle reshaping of how things could work. Robert began to see that many people were stuck, not because they had too little, but because they believed they needed more to begin. They were waiting for more savings, more support, more certainty. But the invention of wealth rarely waits. It moves with the flow of the present. This didn't mean being reckless. Rich Dad was careful, deliberate. But he was also open to options most people didn't even consider. For instance, Robert once found a small piece of property with low value. Most passed it over. But he noticed it was near a growing neighborhood, close to planned development. He researched zoning, asked quiet questions. With very little down, he secured the property. Years later, its value grew, not because he was lucky, but because he looked closer. This story isn't about real estate. It's about re-seeing, about pausing long enough to ask, what have I overlooked? What seems too small, too broken, too early? Because sometimes invention isn't loud or brilliant. It's slow. It's quiet. It hides behind dust and rust and numbers that don't yet add up. And it waits for someone to see it differently. In this way, Rich Dad often compared invention to composting. You take scraps, things others throw away, and let them transform, slowly, silently, into something nourishing, into something useful. This same approach applies to time, too. Many people say they don't have time to build something of their own, But Robert learned that invention doesn't require entire days. It requires attention. 10 quiet minutes of reading, 20 minutes of research, a lunch break used to make a call, a weekend spent sketching a plan. These moments, like drops in a bucket, slowly fill, and when that bucket fills, something begins to form. Sometimes it's a service, sometimes a product, sometimes a pattern of thought that helps you move differently in the world. But it starts small, often imperceptibly small. The art of making something from almost nothing requires 3 things: patience, curiosity, and courage. Patience to wait for the shape to emerge, curiosity to keep looking, and courage to begin even when it feels uncertain. Robert realized that most people stopped themselves before they even tried. They believed the myth that big things require big starts. But often, the most enduring things begin as whispers. A whispered idea, whispered chance, a whispered change in perspective. Rich Dad once told him, money flows to those who solve problems, but most problems wear disguises. They look like inconveniences or failures or messes. Learn to see beneath them. This is invention, not of gadgets or grand plans, but of meaning, of value, of usefulness. So where does that leave us? Not with pressure, not with urgency, but with a question, soft and open. Where, in your life, is there something small, something forgotten, overlooked, or dismissed, that might hold the seed of something more? It could be an unused skill, a space, a contact, a pattern, a story, a question, a need. It could be time. It could be silence. Whatever it is, let yourself notice it tonight, not with urgency, but with ease. Let it sit beside you, like a forgotten stone in your pocket, small but solid, a quiet weight that reminds you. Nothing is truly nothing if you know how to see. Thank you. Let us now bring Lesson 5 to a close with a gentle reflection on change, on perception, and on the quiet skill of adaptation. This story is not about reacting with speed, but about bending with grace. Lesson 5, Story 3, When the landscape shifts, the mind must bend. Imagine standing in a field that has fed your family for years. The soil is familiar, the rhythms are known. You know where the sun lands first in the morning and where the shadows fall by dusk. But one day the ground changes. The wind brings different seasons. The plants no longer grow as they once did. And yet, you remain using the same tools, hoping for the same harvest. Eventually you look up and realize it is not the soil that failed. It is the method that must change. This is how Rich Dad explained the idea behind invention, not as genius, but as gentle adaptation. The world is always shifting, he told Robert, and so the rich learn to shift with it. To invent money in this context is not to manipulate or gamble. It is to notice what no longer works and bend before breaking. It is to adjust your lens when the view grows dim. Robert learned this lesson not from success, but from discomfort. He watched as certain people clung to outdated financial habits. They saved in vehicles that no longer grew. They followed career paths that had become crowded. They waited for the economy to return to what it once was. But the rich, he noticed, didn't resist change. They adapted. sometimes slowly, sometimes uncomfortably, but they moved. He saw his rich dad study the markets, not to time them, but to understand them. He saw him listen to younger voices, read unfamiliar books, explore strange ideas, not always to agree, but to stay open, to keep his mind bendable. This was a kind of humility, Robert realized, a soft strength that said, I do not know everything. I do not need to, but I will remain willing to learn. That willingness is what allows people to invent. When the rules change, they don't freeze. They breathe. They notice. They ask questions like what's emerging, what's missing, what still matters even when the forms have changed. This is what separates invention from reaction. Reaction is fast, loud, and panicked. Invention is slow, quiet, and rooted. Reaction says, fix this now. Invention asks, what might this become? Robert saw this during economic shifts. When the market dipped, many people pulled back, clung tighter, hoped for rescue. But others used that pause to explore. They looked at what people needed, not just what they wanted. They noticed which problems were growing, and then they shaped solutions. Sometimes these became businesses, sometimes investments, sometimes ways to live with less and still feel full. In this way, wealth is not always about accumulation. Sometimes it is about adaptation. It's about knowing when to plant something new and when to let an old harvest go. This doesn't require vast intelligence, it requires attention and trust, not in the market, but in your ability to respond to it. That's why Rich Dad taught Robert to practice bending, not physically, but mentally, to take walks and think, to read things outside his field, to talk to people with different lives, to let his ideas soften at the edges so they could change shape when needed. Because when the landscape shifts, and it always does, a rigid mind will crack, but a flexible one will move. Robert also learned not to mourn change too deeply. It is tempting to wish things would stay as they were, but that is not the nature of life. Economies shift, jobs evolve, skills rise and fall. The richest people, financially and otherwise, are those who greet these shifts like tides. You don't control the tide, but you can learn when to swim, when to float, when to build a different boat. That boat, Rich Dad believed, was often built during quiet seasons, moments of reflection, slowness, even boredom. These are not wasted. They are the compost of insight, the stillness before invention. And so, if your world feels uncertain, know this: uncertainty is not the end. It is often the beginning of a new shape, a shape that asks you not to be faster, but to be softer, to look again, to shift your gaze, to bend your thoughts like reeds in the wind. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and your mind drifts towards sleep, imagine this: a landscape changing gently, and you, not afraid but curious, not hurried but still, ready in your own time to shape something new from the ground beneath your feet. Lesson 6. Work to learn. Don't work for money. In this lesson, Robert explores a shift in purpose. Instead of seeing work as the end goal, Rich Dad encouraged him to see work as a school, a way of gathering skills, understanding people, learning how things move. This lesson is a reminder that knowledge compounds, often quietly, beneath the surface of our daily lives. Over the next 3 stories, we'll explore this lesson, not as a career strategy, but as a slow reimagining of what it means to grow. Lesson 6, Story 1, The Apprenticeship We Didn't Know We Were In. There's a moment in childhood, often quiet and unremarkable, when you first learn how to tie your shoes. You may not remember it clearly, but it likely didn't happen in a classroom. It happened while sitting, watching, trying, failing, trying again. You didn't get paid for learning this. There was no reward other than the ability itself. And yet, from that small effort, a world opened up of walking farther, playing longer, growing up. Rich Dad believed that life is full of lessons like that. Lessons that don't announce themselves. Lessons disguised as chores, as work, as discomfort. But if you pause and look gently, you realize you were always in a kind of apprenticeship. Robert didn't enjoy his first jobs. He worked in shops, offices, errands. The pay was minimal, the tasks repetitive, but Rich Dad encouraged him to look deeper. "You're not here for money," he said. "You're here for insight, for understanding." He meant this quite literally. "Watch how the business is run," he'd whisper. "Notice what the owner does differently. Listen to how they talk to customers. Pay attention to pricing. Ask small questions." So Robert began to look not as a worker, but as a student. He noticed that in every job, someone was solving a problem. Someone was tracking cash flow. Someone was managing people. Someone was adjusting inventory. These were not titles, they were skills. And once seen, they could be studied. And once studied, they could be learned. That was the gift. Because in a world that changes quickly, money can come and go. But a skill truly learned stays. It follows you, grows with you, and reappears when needed. Rich Dad encouraged Robert to seek out skills, not just roles. Work in sales, he'd say. Learn to talk to strangers. Learn to hear no and keep going. Then, work in marketing. Learn how ideas spread. Then, watch the accountants. See how money is tracked. Learn the language of finance. These jobs were not glamorous, but they were part of something deeper, a silent apprenticeship in how the world works. Most people, Robert noticed, chose jobs based on comfort, security, or pay. But they often stayed in those roles for years, never growing, never stretching. Their skills plateaued. Their perspective narrowed, and their options shrank. Rich Dad's path was different. He moved through jobs and businesses not as destinations, but as classrooms. If he needed to learn something new, he'd find a way to work near it. Not always for a long time, but long enough to absorb the rhythm. Robert came to understand that this mindset of working to learn was the real investment. Not into stocks or property, but into the mind, the habits, the awareness. This didn't mean being scattered or impulsive. It meant being curious, strategic, willing to step down in title if it meant stepping up in understanding. Sometimes this looked like humility, being a beginner again, starting over. But Rich Dad never saw that as failure. When you change industries, change role, you expand, he said. Your brain makes new links. Your value grows. Over time, Robert saw that those who embraced this quiet apprenticeship, who worked for skills rather than salary alone, were the ones who became versatile. They could adapt, shift, build. They weren't stuck. They had options. That, he realized, was true freedom. And so perhaps you, too, are in such an apprenticeship. Maybe not formally, but in every conversation, every project, every pattern, there are small things to learn. A way to communicate, a way to listen, a way to manage, a way to hold your center. The pay may be low, the title may be small, but the return, the long, slow, meaningful return, could be immense. It is in noticing these quiet lessons that we begin to shape ourselves slowly into someone who sees the world differently. So tonight, as the quiet deepens, ask softly, not urgently, not analytically, what am I learning? Without even realizing it. Let that question drift beside you like the evening breeze through an open window. Thank you. Let's continue calmly into the next story, one that invites us to look beneath the surface of what we think we're learning and uncover the deeper, quieter knowledge waiting there. Lesson 6. Story 2. The skill beneath the skill. Sometimes we believe we're learning how to do one thing, how to fold clothes, how to run a meeting, how to sell a product. But beneath that visible skill, another, softer skill is quietly forming. One we didn't plan for, one we don't always name. Rich Dad called these invisible skills, and he believed they were often more valuable than the task that revealed them. Robert learned this slowly. As a young man working small jobs, he believed he was learning how to earn money. But Rich Dad asked him to look again. What are you really learning? He would ask after each new experience. Are you learning how to sell? Or how to handle rejection? Are you learning how to speak? Or how to listen when someone's not speaking at all? This question, what lies beneath the skill, became a kind of flashlight for Robert. It allowed him to see depth where others saw only surface. And over time, he began to recognize that real learning is often layered. It happens not just through repetition, but through reflection. Take the example of sales. On the surface, sales is about products and persuasion, but beneath that is the art of empathy. Understanding what someone wants before they even say it, and beneath that is the courage to initiate, the ability to handle a no without losing your center. And beneath that is something even quieter, the ability to keep going when your voice is tired, your mind is doubtful, and your hope is thin. These invisible skills, resilience, observation, emotional regulation, are what Robert came to value most. Not because they appeared on a resume, but because they followed him into every corner of his life. He learned to look at every task as a layered structure. Filing papers, that was attention to detail. Answering phones, that was practicing tone and clarity. Cleaning a stockroom, that was discipline. Pattern, routine. The deeper skills are not always glorious, but they are lasting. They form character. They shape thinking. And in time, they create opportunities others can't see, because others only trained for the surface. Rich Dad often told Robert, "The world will pay you not just for what you do, but for how you do it. And that how, that essence, comes from the skill beneath the skill. In business, Robert began to notice which people were truly adaptable. It wasn't always those with the most impressive titles. It was those who could stay steady in a storm, those who could explain a complex idea simply, those who knew when to speak and when to stay silent. You don't learn these things from manuals. You learn them from doing something ordinary again and again until the extraordinary begins to show. This kind of learning requires stillness, not always in your environment, but in your attention. You must be willing to pause and ask, what is this task really teaching me? What am I practicing right now beneath the action? Robert once worked a job that seemed meaningless. It was repetitive, quiet, low paid. But as he worked, he began to notice his reactions, his boredom, his impatience. And in noticing them, he softened. He learned to work not just through habit, but through presence. He learned how to keep his mind calm, even when the task felt dull. Later in life, when challenges grew larger, when meetings got tense or deals fell through, he realized that this calm was what he needed most. And it had been born years earlier in a simple, quiet job. So often we chase visible progress, but the truest growth often happens underground, like roots in winter, expanding unseen, until spring reveals their strength. Like the visible progress often happens underground. You may be learning something deeper right now, perhaps in your current job or in your daily routines. Maybe you're practicing endurance without knowing it, or grace, or observation, or the ability to step back before you speak. Whatever it is, it matters. It may not be praised, but it is shaping the way you carry yourself, and in time, the way opportunity responds to you. So tonight, let this soft question rest beside you. What quiet skill is being formed beneath your daily effort? You don't need to answer now. Just let it echo, gently, like ripples on still water. Would you like to continue to story 3 of Lesson 6? Thank you. Let's now bring Lesson 6 to a gentle close, with a story not about career ambition or financial tactics, but about the way we grow simply by moving through the world, eyes open, heart quiet, and mind receptive. Lesson 6, Story 3, We learn by moving through the world. There's something we often forget as adults, something children know instinctively. We learn by being in motion. A baby doesn't learn to walk by reading instructions. They crawl, they fall, they wobble, they move through space, guided by curiosity, and in time they find balance. Rich Dad believed this process never really stops. We don't outgrow it. We only change the form. As adults, we may not learn by falling to the floor, but we still learn through motion, through doing, through trying, through being in the world even when we're unsure. Robert came to see this as a kind of learning that didn't always look like learning. There were no classrooms, no lectures, no clear assignments. Instead, there were conversations, decisions, setbacks, quiet successes. Each day, as he moved through life, he was absorbing more than he realized. In a new job, he learned the subtle tone people used when they were unsure. At a networking event, he learned which questions made others open up. In managing his own ventures, he learned how his mood affected those around him, even when he said nothing. All of these lessons came not from study, but but from presence, from simply paying attention while life unfolded around him. Rich Dad encouraged this form of education. Walk through the world with your eyes open, he would say. Not scanning, just open. He didn't mean to be on alert. He meant to be available to patterns, to energy, to what was unsaid. Robert found that the most valuable insights often came this way, not in dramatic revelations, but in small recognitions. A pattern he noticed after the third time it happened. A reaction he finally understood after years of watching. A truth that revealed itself not through logic, but through quiet repetition. This is the kind of learning that builds a life, slowly, subtly. It teaches you how to read a room, how to hear what's beneath someone's words, how to sense when to pause, when to press forward, and when to walk away. These aren't academic skills. They are life skills. And they are learned by moving through the world, one step at a time. Robert noticed that many people waited to act until they felt ready, until they had read enough, saved enough, planned enough. But Rich Dad gently challenged that. You learn by doing, he said, not by waiting. That didn't mean rushing. It meant engaging. Taking a step, even a small one, seeing what happens, reflecting, adjusting, then stepping again. The process wasn't always smooth. Mistakes were made, feelings were bruised, but even these carried lessons, if you allowed them to. Robert came to think of every job, every venture, even every awkward conversation, as a kind of teacher. Not always a kind one, but a real one. He also noticed that the more he moved through the world with this mindset, the more confident he became. Not because he had fewer doubts, but because he learned he could move with them. That he didn't need to know everything before beginning. This gentle confidence, Rich Dad said, was more valuable than any degree. It was the knowing that you could begin, that you could learn, that you could recover, that you could find your balance again, even after falling. Over time, this became Robert's quiet foundation, not built in a day or even a year, but over thousands of small movements. A conversation, a question, a risk, a reflection, step by step. And perhaps so it is for you. Perhaps you're learning right now, not because you're studying, but because you're living, because you're trying, because you're still curious, even in moments of fatigue. You may not feel like you're gaining anything, but as you move through your days, something is being shaped. Strength, awareness, understanding, soft skills that don't shout, but that slowly build the scaffolding of your life. So tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, let yourself believe, just for a moment, that even in stillness, you are learning. Even in ordinary days, your inner world is unfolding. That you are not behind. You are simply in motion, still becoming. Let that thought rest gently beside you, like the hush of footsteps on a soft path. Lesson 7. Overcoming obstacles. This lesson is about what holds people back, even when they understand money. It's not about intelligence or opportunity, but about fear, cynicism, laziness, bad habits, and arrogance. These aren't flaws, they're human. And if we notice them with kindness instead of judgment, we begin to change, not by resisting who we are, but by softening into who we could become. Let us begin with fear. Not the loud kind, but the subtle kind that walks beside us each day, and sometimes sits quietly between us and our next decision. Lesson 7, Story 1. The quiet weight of fear. Fear is not always dramatic. It doesn't always arrive with shouting or urgency. Sometimes it's a quiet voice, a shadow at the edge of the room, a soft pressure in the chest when you think about trying something new. Rich Dad understood this kind of fear well. Not the fear of snakes or storms, but the kind of fear that wraps itself around money and worth and what might happen if we fail. Most people don't become rich, he told Robert, not because they can't, but because fear tells them not to try. Robert learned early that fear isn't something to eliminate. It's something to listen to sit beside, to learn from. He noticed that most people's financial fears weren't about numbers. They were about loss, losing money, losing status, losing security. But beneath that, even deeper, was often the fear of embarrassment, of trying and failing, of being seen as foolish. So they avoided risk, not because the risk was large, but because the imagined feeling of failure loomed so large in the mind. Rich Dad called this the fear tax, a kind of invisible cost people pay every day simply by staying safe, by not investing, by not asking questions, by not learning more. It's not a cost you see on paper, but you feel it over time in the form of missed chances and quiet regrets. Robert realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to move forward with fear still present, to acknowledge its voice, but not let it steer the ship. He saw that those who made progress didn't pretend to be fearless. They simply practiced action. They built a relationship with discomfort. They took small steps, then slightly larger ones, and with each step, fear grew quieter. Not because it vanished, but because it was met. He once watched his rich dad lose money in a deal. It stung, but what Robert remembered wasn't the loss. It was the way his father responded. He paused. He studied the mistake. He adjusted. And then he moved forward again. No one likes to lose, Rich Dad said, but it's the price of the lesson. If you only play games you can't lose, you're not really playing. That line stayed with Robert. It helped him see loss not as failure, but as feedback, not as shame, but as signal. In contrast, he saw others live with a kind of frozen fear. They worked jobs they didn't enjoy. They saved a little, spent a little, but never took the time to learn, to invest, to explore. They feared loss so much that they stayed in the same place for decades. This wasn't weakness. It was humanity. But it came with a cost. Robert learned that financial growth and personal growth required exposure, not to recklessness, but to stretch, to lean slightly beyond what's comfortable, to try. And to try, you must be willing to lose something. That might be money, or time, or the comfort of being unchallenged. But in return, you gain something that can't be bought. Experience, clarity, strength. Fear, in this light, is not your enemy. It is a teacher. It shows you where your edge is. And when you lean gently toward that edge, you expand. So tonight, perhaps consider this soft question not as a challenge, but as an invitation. What would I do if fear didn't speak so loudly? Let that question rest with you, not to be answered, but to be held, like a stone in the pocket of your sleep. Thank you. Now let us walk a little further into the garden of our inner world, where not all obstacles are dramatic. Some are subtle, persistent, even quiet. Like overgrown weeds, they don't shout for attention, but they quietly take up space until the path we once saw clearly is no longer visible. Lesson 7, Story 2, A Garden Overrun by Weeds. Imagine a garden left unattended, not for weeks, but for years. The soil remains, the light still reaches it, and deep beneath the surface, the seeds of possibility are still there. But on the surface, the weeds have taken over, not because the gardener failed, but because they simply stopped noticing. Rich Dad compared the human mind to a garden, a place where thoughts grow, habits take root, and actions flower, if tended to with care. But he warned Robert gently, if you don't cultivate this garden, it will still grow, just not what you hoped for. Instead of learning, there is assumption. Instead of curiosity, there is cynicism. Instead of discipline, there is delay. And over time, these patterns become the landscape. Robert learned this when he began speaking with people about investing. Many responded not with excitement, but with hesitation, even sarcasm. That won't work, some said. I don't trust the system, others would add. Only the rich get richer. And Rich Dad would say, not unkindly, those are weeds. Cynicism may feel like protection, but often it's just fear in disguise. It guards us from disappointment, but it also blocks us from insight. Cynicism may feel like protection, but often it's just fear in disguise. It guards us from disappointment, but it also blocks us from insight. Laziness may feel like rest, but often it's resistance, a soft fog that keeps us from reaching toward what matters. Bad habits, too, are like vines. They start small. Checking the phone, avoiding the budget, putting off the reading, but left alone, they entangle our better intentions. Rich Dad never shamed these patterns. He simply encouraged Robert to notice them, to sit with them, to ask quietly, is this thought helping me grow? And if it wasn't, he'd say, then it's time to begin tending the garden again, not by tearing everything up at once, but by removing one weed, planting one seed, watering one section. For Robert, this began with awareness. He noticed his habit of assuming he already knew enough, of saying, I've heard this before, of brushing off new information because it wasn't exciting. But when he slowed down, when he listened more deeply, he realized how much he'd missed. He began reading old books again, taking notes on conversations, practicing patience when learning something unfamiliar. And slowly, his inner garden began to shift. Rich Dad believed that most people underestimate how much they've let their mental garden go, not because they're lazy, but because the weeds grow quietly. A single negative belief, a quiet avoidance, a low, constant hum of doubt. And so, he taught Robert to do regular walkthroughs, not of his property, but of his mind. To ask, what patterns are showing up again? Where am I dismissive? Where am I closed off? These are not questions of judgment. They are questions of care, of maintenance, of return. Because every mind, yours, mine, everyone's, needs tending. The goal is not perfection, not a flawless plot of land, just space, a little room to think, to imagine, to act with intention again. Robert saw that people who succeeded financially didn't just have knowledge, they had clarity. And clarity doesn't grow in cluttered soil. They had time, not just on their calendar, but in their mind, space between worry and thought, between impulse and choice. And that space came from weeding, from choosing, to replace old patterns with new ones, to turn off the noise, to take the walk, to ask the question, to let go of the belief that says, this is just how I am, because even the most tangled garden can bloom again. Tonight, as your body relaxes and the rhythm of breath returns, imagine a small patch of earth, yours to tend. There are weeds, but there is also warmth and soil, and somewhere underneath, something waiting to grow. Let that image rest beside you, like the quiet promise of spring. Thank you. Now we close Lesson 7 with one final story, not about enemies or setbacks in the outside world, but about the soft limitations we carry within, not the kind that scream, I can't, but the ones that gently whisper, I already know. This is a story about self-awareness, and how sometimes the hardest thing to see is ourselves. Lesson 7, Story 3, What the Mirror Doesn't Always Show. A mirror reflects what is in front of it, your face, your posture, the lines of your expression. But some things are not visible in glass, like the thoughts behind your eyes, or the habits tucked behind your smile, or the assumptions resting just beneath your voice. These too are part of who we are, but they don't always show themselves. Not until we look another way. Rich Dad taught Robert that arrogance was one of the most subtle obstacles to growth. Not the loud kind, not boasting or ego, but the quiet form, the belief that we already know enough. I've read that before. I've tried that once. I already understand. It sounds confident, even intelligent, but often it's a closing of the door before we've even stepped inside. Not out of pride, but out of protection. Robert came to see that arrogance is not about thinking too highly of ourselves. It's often about fearing that we're not enough, and so we defend ourselves with certainty, with answers, with dismissal. Rich Dad called this the false full cup. When a person's mind seems full, but what fills it isn't wisdom, it's resistance. And until that cup is gently emptied, until we release the need to appear capable, we can't truly grow. He told Robert, always keep part of your mind unoccupied. That's the space where new things land. In Robert's own life, he noticed how often he'd skim books instead of studying them, how often he assumed he understood an idea because it sounded familiar, how easily he could dismiss someone younger or from a different background, thinking, what could they possibly teach me? But the richest insights often came from unexpected places. A question from a child, a casual comment from a stranger, a forgotten line in an old book, read slowly this time. And slowly, Robert began to unlearn the idea that being smart meant knowing everything. He started to see learning as a cycle, not a ladder. something that spirals back on itself, deepening each time, rather than progressing in straight lines. He realized that humility, not insecurity, but openness, was the true key to overcoming mental obstacles. This didn't mean doubting himself. It meant being willing to not always have the answer. To let silence be part of the learning. To ask soft questions, even in rooms where he was the most experienced person. Rich Dad believed this was one of the most important mindsets in both life and money. Staying teachable. Not just in early years, but always. He admired people who could pause and say, "I don't know," or "maybe I misunderstood," or "what else might be true." These weren't signs of weakness, they were signs of strength, because they showed a person still growing. And growth, he believed, was the ultimate wealth, the one that compounds forever. Robert saw that some people earned money quickly and lost it just as fast, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they stopped listening. Their inner mirror showed success, and so they stopped looking inward. Others, meanwhile, grew slowly, patiently. They read, asked questions, reflected, and over time their wealth grew, not just in dollars, but in perspective. This kind of growth is hard to measure. You won't see it in a bank statement, but you'll feel it in moments of pressure, in how you respond to conflict, in how you recover from mistakes, in how you teach others. So tonight, as this day comes to a close, let the mirror of your thoughts soften. There's no judgment here. Only the quiet suggestion that you are always becoming, that what you know is important, but what you don't yet know is just as precious. Let that idea rest with you, like a window gently opening in a still room. Lesson 8, Getting Started. This lesson is about motion, not grand, sweeping change, but subtle beginnings. Rich Dad believed that the difference between those who learn and those who grow is action. Not loud action, not public action, but simple motion that whispers, "I'm ready to try." Lesson 8. Story 1. The smallest step still moves you forward. I'll correct. There's a kind of invisible moment in life, not often seen, not always remembered, when a person moves from thinking to doing. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It could be a phone call, a journal entry, a visit to the library, a new folder on a quiet desktop. But in that moment, something shifts, and the world, softly, begins to open. Rich Dad used to say, "You don't have to leap forward, you just have to lean." Robert remembered this when he first felt overwhelmed by money. The numbers, the books, the terminology, the systems. It felt like a wave too wide to swim across. So instead, he took a small step. He started writing down every dollar he spent. That's it, a notebook, a pen, a few minutes a day. But from that habit, clarity began to form. He saw where his energy went, where his choices spoke louder than his words, and in that quiet noticing, he found footing. Sometimes we believe that getting started must feel bold, that we must feel ready, confident, certain. But readiness rarely arrives before movement. It often shows up as a result of movement. Robert watched this in others too. One friend wanted to invest but kept waiting for the right time. Another wanted to build a business, but waited until the plan was perfect. And still another wanted to read about money, but felt too behind to begin. Each was waiting to be swept forward, but Rich Dad believed in gentle beginnings. Even the wind needs something to push, he'd say. He taught Robert to create momentum, not with pressure, but with kindness, to set 1 hour aside, to ask one question, to learn one new word, to save $1 more than yesterday. And over time, these motions built something real, a bridge, a trail, a new way of seeing. Because getting started isn't about doing everything. It's about doing something, and trusting that the something, however small, contains more power than you know. Robert noticed that people often confuse small with insignificant, but he came to believe the opposite was true. Small steps are often the most significant, because they represent the moment when you decided to care, to try, to believe, however quietly, that your life could change. He also saw how emotion played a role, how fear, perfectionism, or past failures could make a person hesitate. So he began asking softer questions, not, "What's the best move?" but, "What feels light enough to carry today?" That became his guide. He didn't need to map the whole journey, just the next step. And perhaps you've felt it too, a nudge, a quiet pull toward something you've been putting off. A drawer you want to clean, a number you've been avoiding, a conversation you want to start. You don't need to do it all. You only need to begin. And once you do, the silence around it changes. It no longer feels like a weight, but like something gently in motion. Rich Dad used to smile at the idea of progress. "It's not about running," he said. "It's about moving, consistently enough that the world starts to respond." And the world does respond, in tiny ways. A person you needed to meet appears, a book finds its way to your nightstand, a new question rises up where once there was only doubt. This is how life begins to shift, not through force, but through movement. And so tonight, in the softness of your room, you might ask, not with urgency, but with quiet wonder, what's one gentle step I could take when morning returns? Let that question drift beside you as the first signs of change begin to form, not in noise, but in the hush. Thank you. Let's now continue with a gentle story that reminds us we are rarely starting from scratch. The tools we need aren't always out there, waiting to be found. Often they are already with us, quiet, familiar, and simply waiting to be noticed. Lesson 8, Story 2, Tools You Already Carry. Imagine an old wooden toolbox, tucked away in the back of a dusty shed. Inside it are tools passed down, not new, not shiny, but worn and familiar. You may have forgotten about them. You may not even remember how they got there. But when the need arises, and you open that box again, you realize everything you need to begin is already within reach. Rich Dad believed that most people didn't lack resources. They lacked awareness of their own resourcefulness. He taught Robert that getting started isn't just about acquiring new knowledge. It's about rediscovering what you already know. Robert learned this not in a business class or a formal seminar, but in a small moment when trying to figure out how to afford a new book on investing. He didn't want to ask his rich dad for money. He also didn't want to wait. So he remembered something simple. He knew how to wash cars. He made a small flyer, walked around the neighborhood, and by the end of the weekend, he had enough not only for the book, but also for a small notebook to take notes in. It was then that Rich Dad smiled and said, "You just used a tool you forgot you had." This became a lesson that echoed throughout Robert's life. We carry more tools than we think. A story you can tell, a conversation you once had, a language you speak, a hardship you overcame, a question you're not afraid to ask, a kindness you offer that opens doors, a skill you learned from a parent, a job, or even a mistake. These are not always visible, but when you begin to act, even gently, they emerge. Rich Dad encouraged Robert to make a list, not of goals, but of tools. Write down the things you already know how to do, he said. Even the ones that don't feel useful now, one day they will. So Robert wrote, "I know how to listen carefully. I know how to notice what people need. I know how to ask for help. I know how to learn from books. I know how to keep going after a failure." And slowly he began to see himself not as someone beginning from zero, but as someone building from something. This shift in mindset softened the fear of starting. It reminded him that the next step isn't a leap into the unknown. It's a step onto a path he's already walked. Even if only in pieces, he met many people who wanted to begin something new. A business, an investment, a habit. But they felt they weren't ready. And so, Rich Dad would ask them, "What do you already carry?" Most of them paused. They hadn't thought to look inward. But as they began to speak, the tools emerged. A strength in relationships, a natural eye for design, a past experience in managing money, even if only for a small household. These weren't magic answers, but they were places to begin. And beginning, as Robert had learned, is where everything changes. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about trusting that you'll remember what you need as you move forward, that the knowledge you've collected, the lessons you've lived, are not lost. They are simply resting, waiting for your attention. So if you find yourself wanting to start something new but unsure how, consider this. You may already be holding part of the answer. Not in your hands, perhaps, but in your memories, in your habits, in your quiet, practiced ways of understanding the world. Tonight, as you settle into stillness, ask yourself, gently, without urgency, what quiet tool have I forgotten I carry? Let that question sit beside you, like a key placed on the nightstand, ready when you are. Thank you. Now we bring Lesson 8 to a close with a soft reflection on timing, patience, and the quiet faith it takes to plant something, even when you're not yet sure what season it is. This story is not about speed, it is about care and trust. Lesson 8. Story 3. Planting before you know the season. There is a small ritual in farming, one that happens quietly, before the sun rises high. A seed is placed into the soil, not because the rain is guaranteed, not because the weather will cooperate, but because planting is what begins the growing. The farmer does not demand certainty. The farmer trusts in timing. Rich Dad believed that most people wait too long to plant. They wait until conditions are perfect. until the forecast is clear, until every question is answered. And in doing so, they miss the window when quiet planting would have started something, even if that something would take time to emerge. Robert often felt unsure, especially early on. There were so many unknowns. Should he invest now? Was this the right book to study? Would his idea work? The questions were real. The uncertainty felt heavy. But Rich Dad gently reminded him, "You won't know the season until you begin." That meant take a step, start learning, make the small move, and then pay attention. The feedback will tell you what to do next. This didn't mean rushing. It meant planting, slowly, deliberately, without expecting results overnight. He came to see that the most successful people he met weren't those who knew everything in advance. They were those who were willing to begin, gently, and adjust with the weather, to respond rather than control, to tend rather than force. Robert started doing this in small ways, reading one lesson even when he didn't feel ready for the full book, asking one question in a room full of experts, starting a small side project with minimal risk. And from those early seeds, understanding began to bloom, not all at once, but in rhythms. Sometimes nothing sprouted right away. That was okay. Sometimes the soil seemed dry. The idea didn't catch. The motivation faded. But he learned to sit with that too. Not everything grows quickly. Some seeds need to rest. Others fail and make space for new ones. Rich Dad called this planting in faith. Not blind optimism, but gentle belief. That motion creates possibility. That your effort today, though quiet and invisible, might someday feed you. Robert learned not to measure progress too soon, not to look for results in the first few days. He gave his actions room to breathe, and in that space, something subtle grew. Patience, confidence, trust in the process. He also learned that not every field is yours to plant. Some opportunities don't feel right, no matter how promising they seem. Some risks are not your kind of risk. Some paths belong to others, and that's okay too. Plant where the soil feels honest, where the rhythm feels kind, where the work, though quiet, brings a sense of meaning. He noticed that people who waited too long for the right time often found themselves stuck, not because they lacked knowledge, but because they expected certainty first. But seasons, like life, are not always predictable, and sometimes the seed you plant in a cloudy spring grows strongest by summer. So, Robert began planting regularly, not wildly, not recklessly, but consistently. One new idea, one new call, one new habit, one new reflection. And over time, the harvest came, not all at once, but steadily. Perhaps you too have something you've been waiting to begin. A habit, a dream, a conversation, a quiet shift. You don't need to be ready. You only need to begin, to plant. Even if you're not sure it will bloom, even if the winds are still cool, even if the world is quiet around you. Because it's not always about results. Sometimes it's simply about saying, I am willing. I am tending. I am here. Tonight, as your breath softens and the day fades, you might wonder, without urgency, without demand, what small seed could I place into the soil of tomorrow? And then rest. The season will come. Lesson 9. Still want more? Here are some to-dos. This lesson was originally a list, a set of practical suggestions from Rich Dad to Robert. But behind each suggestion is something deeper. A mindset, a small philosophy, a reminder that personal growth is not a sprint, but a series of soft decisions made one thoughtful day at a time. Lesson 9. Story 1. Paying yourself first isn't about money. You've probably heard the phrase before, pay yourself first. It's echoed in finance books, whispered in budgeting blogs, passed around like a golden rule of wealth. But for Robert, and for Rich Dad, it wasn't just a habit. It was a philosophy. And it wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. When Rich Dad said, pay yourself first, he didn't mean selfishly. He meant with reverence. Before you give away your time, your energy, your peace, he would say, set something aside for yourself. Even if it's small. Robert first practiced this as a teenager. He wasn't making much, just small payments from part-time jobs. But each time money came in, he would tuck a few dollars away, not because he had big plans, but because it felt right, like he was honoring the part of himself that worked, that tried, that showed up. It wasn't always easy. Bills would come. Friends would ask for outings. The temptation to dip into that small envelope was always there. But the more he resisted, the more respect he felt. Not just for the money, but for the discipline behind it. This is what Rich Dad was really teaching. The habit of self-regard. Not vanity, not greed, but a quiet acknowledgement of worth. To pay yourself first is to say, gently, I empty. Not more than others, not at their expense, but enough. Robert noticed that those who skipped this step often struggled in subtle ways. They gave their best energy to everyone else, their thoughts to distractions, their money to obligations, and at the end of the day, there was nothing left for them, not even attention. The Rich Dad began applying the principle beyond money. In time, Robert did too. He set aside quiet mornings to read. He made space in his week for reflection. He saved not just cash, but focus. He paid himself first with rest, with solitude, with intention. And slowly, he became more generous, not less, because he was no longer pouring from an empty vessel. That's the paradox. When you fill your own cup, just a little, you have more to offer others, not out of resentment, but from a place of fullness. Robert also learned that this habit, done over time, builds confidence. When you pay yourself first, you begin to trust yourself. You no longer feel entirely at the mercy of bills or the market or other people's needs. You know deep down that you can take care of you even a little, and sometimes a little is enough. This habit became a compass. When faced with a decision, Robert would ask, does this investment, this project, this relationship pay me back, not just in money, but in learning, in purpose, in peace? If the answer was yes, even softly, he moved forward. If the answer was no, he paused. You don't have to build walls. You don't have to say no to everything. But you can begin to build a rhythm, one that remembers your value, one that feeds your strength before you give it all away. Tonight, as your breath slows and your mind grows quiet, you might wonder, not what to earn or what to budget, but simply, what could I save for myself? A moment, a thought, a little space to grow. That is a kind of wealth too. Lesson 9, Story 2, Surrounding Yourself with Quiet Wisdom. There is a saying that echoes through time. You become like the people you spend the most time with, not all at once, not obviously, but slowly, like tea steeping in water. Their values, their rhythms, their beliefs about what's possible. These things begin to shape you, almost without notice. Rich Dad spoke often about this, not as a warning, but as a gentle truth. He believed we are always becoming, and part of that becoming is determined by the voices we let into our life. Not just who we talk to, but who we listen to. As a young man, Robert spent time with both of his fathers, his biological dad who was educated and cautious, and his rich dad who was curious and willing to take risks. Neither was wrong, neither was perfect, but their thinking left marks. Small ones at first, then deeper. He noticed that after spending time with Rich Dad, his own thoughts began to shift. He questioned more. He wondered differently. He asked about systems, not just tasks. He began to listen to the silence in conversations, not just the words. Rich Dad encouraged this, not by instructing Robert directly, but by modeling a kind of presence. Calm, open, curious. His confidence didn't push, it invited. That was the lesson. Wisdom doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it waits quietly, ready when you are. Over time, Robert came to see that the people around him didn't just influence his decisions, they shaped his assumptions. About money, about time, about what kind of life was possible. He met people who always talked about what couldn't be done, who focused on problems instead of patterns. And after those conversations, he would feel smaller, more hesitant. Then he spent time with those who asked soft, wide questions. What if we tried this? What are you noticing? Where's the pressure coming from? And after those conversations, he felt lighter, more capable. So he began to choose differently. He didn't abandon old friends. He didn't build walls. But he adjusted the circle of influence. The voices closest to him, the ones that helped him stay open, not just ambitious but grounded, not just driven but thoughtful. Sometimes the wisest voice came from a book, a mentor he never met, a long-ago thinker whose words had settled quietly into paper, waiting for someone to find them. He kept those voices close too. Rich Dad reminded him, you don't have to chase loud advice. Just sit near people who think clearly, who've made peace with uncertainty, who know what matters and are willing to live by it. This wasn't just about success, it was about ease, about creating a space around him that made growth feel possible, not pressured. Robert noticed that some people carry chaos, others carry clarity. Neither is right or wrong, but when you're trying to build something, especially something new, clarity is the more nurturing soil. So he practiced quiet discernment, not judging, just noticing. Who brings me closer to the person I want to become? And as that circle grew stronger, so did he. This idea isn't about isolation. It's about nourishment. We all need people. People who see something in us we haven't yet seen. People whose calm becomes our own. People whose thinking opens doors we hadn't noticed. Tonight, as the air settles around you and the day fades, you might ask, without pressure, Who are the quiet voices I want to keep near? And just let that question rest, like a gentle presence in the room. Thank you. Let us now conclude Lesson 9 with a final story, one that brings together motion and mindfulness. A reminder that sometimes the best way to understand the world, to understand ourselves, is simply to do. Not to act for results, but to act as a form of listening. Lesson 9. Story 3. Action as a form of listening. When we think of listening, we often picture stillness, ears attentive, words flowing from one person to another. But Rich Dad taught Robert something different, something softer, that doing, when done mindfully, is its own form of listening. That when you act, especially when unsure, the world begins to speak back. Robert came to understand this through experience. He didn't always know the right move. He didn't always feel ready. But when he tried something, even something small, it gave him feedback. And that feedback taught him more than hours of thought ever could. It wasn't about rushing into things. It was about moving gently, then watching, starting a small side project, trying a new conversation, reading a different kind of book, and noticing what came up in response. Sometimes the feedback was external. A person reacted, a result appeared, a door opened. Sometimes it was internal. His energy shifted, his curiosity deepened, or something inside him felt out of sync. Rich Dad taught him to pay attention to both. He used to say, "You can think all day about swimming, but you won't understand the water until your skin meets it." That, Robert realized, was what most people missed. They wanted clarity first. They wanted to know how it would feel before beginning. But feeling often comes from beginning. And once you move, even a little, you begin to sense, is this path nourishing or depleting? Is it aligned or merely expected? Is this fear or just discomfort in motion? These are subtle signals, and they don't arrive during planning. They arrive during practice. Robert noticed that people who were stuck often stayed in a loop of overthinking. Should I? What if? Is this the right time? And the longer they stayed in that loop, the further they drifted from themselves. Rich Dad would gently interrupt these spirals. Do something small, he'd say, then see how it feels. And it worked. A small conversation revealed a hidden passion. A few minutes of journaling led to a buried idea. Turning a bit of research opened a new path forward. None of these were grand gestures, but each one created movement, and movement, however quiet, invites response. Robert learned to listen through action. He asked not, "What's the perfect next step?" but "What's a step I can hear myself in?" Because when you act with presence, the world speaks back, not in noise, but in subtle direction. He discovered that the very act of trying reshaped his question. That curiosity wasn't just a state of mind. It was something you cultivate by being in motion. And when something didn't work, he didn't call it failure. He called it information. That was the shift. Action was no longer a test. It was a teacher. He wasn't acting to prove anything. He was acting to understand. And that changed everything. It softened his fear. It quieted his doubt. It allowed him to move gently, even when the path was foggy. Perhaps you've felt this too. A sense that thinking alone isn't enough. That the real clarity comes only after you've begun. Even if your first move is small. Even if it's only for yourself. Tonight, as sleep draws near, you might rest with this thought. Sometimes the world speaks not when you ask, but when you act. And your action need not be loud. It need only be sincere. Let that idea accompany you into the quiet, like a ripple waiting to return. Lesson 10, Story 1. Desire can be gentle too. Desire is often painted as a flame, bold, consuming, restless, but not all desire shouts. Some desire hums. Some waits patiently beneath the surface of daily life. It doesn't demand wealth or attention. It whispers of ease, dignity, security, and that too is a form of genius. Rich Dad began every financial lesson not with charts or accounts, but with one question. What do you want? Not in the sense of impulse or indulgence, but in the soft, spacious sense of longing. What kind of life would feel good to live? What would peace look like for you? Robert was young then, and his desires were simple. Freedom from worry, choices that felt his own, the ability to explore without counting every dollar. He didn't want luxury, he wanted breathing room. And Rich Dad smiled. That's where it starts, he said. Not with the money, with the clarity. Over time, Robert saw that most people avoided desire, not because they had none, but because they'd been taught not to trust it. Desire, they were told, was selfish, or dangerous, or foolish, so they stopped listening. They worked, they saved, they planned, but without clarity, their motion was anxious, reactive, aimless. Rich Dad believed that when desire is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It becomes a quiet ache, and aches left unexamined often lead to restless choices, spending that doesn't satisfy, striving that doesn't soothe. So he taught Robert to sit with his wants, not to chase them, not to deny them, but to listen, to ask, what would this give me? What deeper need is behind this longing? Often the answer wasn't wealth. It was peace, simplicity, connection, control over time, relief from worry. And that, Rich Dad believed, was true genius. When a person understands their wants well enough to meet them directly, without disguise. Robert also learned that desire is the engine behind learning. People don't study money just for information. They study it because they want something. Freedom, generosity, legacy, understanding. And if you know what you want gently, you'll be more willing to learn patiently. You'll seek what nourishes, not just what dazzles. He watched people try to fake motivation, push themselves to read, to invest, to act. But without honest desire, the learning didn't stick. Others, with smaller incomes but clearer hearts, made quiet progress. They didn't move fast, but they moved surely. Desire was their compass, not loud, but steady. Tonight you might take a moment, not to set a goal, but to feel for a truth. What kind of space would you like to live in? What kind of mornings would make you feel safe? What kind of relationship would you like to have with money? Let the answers arrive like soft waves. They don't need to be acted on, only heard, because the first sign of awakening isn't action, it's attention, a quiet honoring of what matters to you. And that too is genius. Thank you. Let's now continue with a gentle reflection on one of the quietest but most powerful forces in our lives, what we feed our minds. Just as a fire grows with what we place into it, so too does our awareness. And sometimes, all it takes is a slow, consistent spark. Lesson 10. Story 2. Feeding the mind like a fire. Imagine a small campfire at dusk. The air is still, the wood is dry. The first flicker appears, not bold, not roaring, just a soft curl of flame. It isn't heat yet. It isn't light for the whole night, but it is the beginning of both. This is how Rich Dad described the mind. A fire, he said, that either fades in quiet neglect or grows from gentle tending. What we read, what we hear, what we reflect upon, these are the twigs and branches that keep it alive. Robert didn't always understand this. In his early years, he thought growth would come from big actions, starting a company, investing boldly, making something happen. But Rich Dad invited him to start somewhere smaller. He handed him a book. He asked him a question. He encouraged him to sit quietly with an idea until it became his own. That was the lesson. Not everything needed to be done. Some things simply needed to be understood, and understanding comes slowly, like heat building from an ember. Robert noticed how easy it was to forget this. The world around him was fast. It prized action, reaction, speed. But minds, real minds, don't grow like that. They grow in silence, in attention, in the space between distraction. He began creating space in his day to read, not quickly, not to finish, but to absorb. Sometimes just one paragraph was enough to light something new. Other times he'd revisit the same idea again and again until it softened and unfolded in his own thinking. Rich Dad called this feeding the fire. Even 5 quiet minutes a day could change the temperature of your mind. He also reminded Robert that what we consume doesn't just come from books. It comes from conversations, from what we scroll past, from the background noise we allow. Everything, he said, leaves a trace. So Robert began to notice. Did this news story leave him thoughtful or anxious? Did that conversation open something up or close him down? He didn't judge. He just paid attention. And slowly he adjusted. He started surrounding himself with calmer voices. He let go of content that filled his mind with noise but not depth. He stopped seeking inspiration that left him restless, and instead he turned to quiet thinkers. Old books, gentle teachers, conversations that made him ask softer questions. And the fire grew. Not quickly, but steadily. That was the gift. With time, his thinking warmed. His choices gained clarity. He began to act not from pressure, but from understanding. Because the fire inside him, his learning, his thoughtfulness, his perspective, was strong enough to guide him. Rich Dad believed that financial genius wasn't a burst of brilliance. It was a steady mind, a warmed mind, a mind that had been fed with care. And this is something available to everyone. You don't need credentials. You don't need to rush. You only need to tend, to listen, to return. Even now, as the day winds down and sleep approaches, you are feeding the fire with gentleness, with curiosity, with quiet trust. So tonight, as your thoughts soften and settle, you might ask, without needing an answer, what am I feeding my mind with these days? And how does it feel inside me? Let that wonder keep the flame alive through the hush of night. Thank you. Now we gently bring Lesson 10 to a close with one final reflection. A soft look at mastery, not the loud kind that boasts of achievements, but the quiet path of deep attention. A path walked not for recognition, but for the peace it brings to know something well. Lesson 10, Story 3, Choosing the Quiet Path of Mastery. There's a quiet kind of person you may have met before. They don't speak much, but when they do, it's clear they understand something deeply. They are not flashy. They do not claim to be experts, but their hands move with ease. Their thoughts come slowly but surely, and there's a kind of calm that follows them. These are people on the path of mastery. Rich Dad believed that real growth wasn't about talent, it was about attention. It wasn't about being the smartest in the room, it was about being the most consistent. He often told Robert, "Find something worth knowing well, then return to it often." This idea of returning stayed with Robert for years. In a world that rewards novelty, it takes quiet courage to stay with one thing, to deepen rather than jump, to refine rather than replace. When Robert first started learning about money, he moved quickly. Books, workshops, mentors, ideas. It felt exciting. But soon, he realized that jumping from idea to idea left him with scattered knowledge. Rich Dad noticed. He gently suggested slowing down. "Pick a small area," he said, "and go deep. Learn not just the how, but the why. Learn where the idea came from, what it means, where it might be misunderstood." So Robert chose one: cash flow. Not assets, not taxes, not real estate, just cash flow. He read, he asked questions, he watched people, he tracked his own habits. And over time, the idea transformed. It became part of how he saw the world. He didn't rush. He didn't try to master everything at once, but slowly that single concept became a tool, then a lens, then a quiet form of power. That was mastery. Not loud, not instant, but earned through repetition, through humility, through care. Robert came to see that mastery wasn't a goal. It was a direction. You never fully arrive. You just deepen. And as you deepen, life becomes clearer. Choices become simpler. Fear softens. He met people who were always chasing the next idea. They had knowledge but not peace. And others, who knew a few things very well, moved through life with quiet confidence. Rich Dad encouraged him to become the latter. Be the kind of person, he said, who doesn't know everything, but understands something so well that others feel calm just listening to you. This wasn't about ego. It was about trust. And trust, Robert saw, begins with yourself. When you return to something over and over, an idea, a practice, a principle, you begin to trust your own relationship with it. You don't need applause. You don't need to be loud. You just know. Perhaps you've already chosen something, a craft, a habit, a way of seeing. Or perhaps your path is still forming. Either way, the invitation is the same. Return. Not to force mastery, but to build a home within it. Tonight, as the stillness deepens around you, you might ask yourself, not to solve, but simply to wonder, what is something I would love to understand quietly, deeply, and well? And then rest. The path will welcome you back when you're ready. And now, as we come to the end of this quiet journey, we hope these gentle stories drawn from Rich Dad, Poor Dad offered you more than just lessons about money. We hope they helped you slow down, reflect a little deeper, and maybe see your own path with a little more calm and clarity. Whether you're just beginning your financial story or somewhere further along, remember, understanding takes time, and peace is part of the process. If this brought you comfort or insight tonight, feel free to subscribe for more calm stories like these. Until next time, rest well, and let these thoughts settle softly into your dreams.